"A ragged black woman thinks she belongs here?" The police officer sneered in open court as the woman in an old coat stood silently in front of him. He mocked her, ridiculed her, and called her a living proof of societal failure. The entire courtroom laughed along, until she pulled a small object from her pocket, an FBI badge. His face froze. Not a single apology. No one dared to move, and social media exploding. This plot twist felt straight out of a movie. What's your take on this turn of events? Which state do you live in? District Courtroom Number 3 was wedged between two decaying government buildings, its peeling plaster walls seemingly having witnessed far too many trials where the law was merely a faint shadow behind prejudice. The air reeked of stale air conditioning, sweat, moldy paper, and lukewarm coffee, filling the box-shaped room where the audience benches rose like broken teeth from chipped ceramic tiles. Near the back, directly beneath the pale flicker of a fluorescent light, a black woman was led in, handcuffed, barefoot, wearing a tattered coat, hair frayed like scorched straw. In front of her stood the defendant's bench, beneath which lay a crusted, yellow and maroon smear of dried vomit. Maybe someone's breakfast, maybe blood and saliva. No one cleaned it. No one cared. She was shoved down right next to it, as if deliberately positioned between disgrace and filth. Delray Moore, the patrol officer on duty that day, followed behind, making no effort to hide his smugness. He walked with the swagger of someone who believed the badge on his chest gave him the right to categorize human worth. When he spotted a group of white teenagers sitting in the front row, watching out of curiosity, he smirked, pointed at her and said, "You kids better look real close. This is what happens when you don't learn to bow your head." Street trash. The teens burst into laughter. One started recording a video and typed something onto the screen. Some hashtag like Trash Court Day. She didn't respond, didn't bow her head, didn't scream. She simply sat upright, eyes fixed on the void between the dusty curtains and the still empty judge's chair. Her face, coated in a thin gray-brown layer of dirt, showed no expression, but her eyes, those eyes, didn't flicker with fear, nor well up like those who'd been dragged here for being homeless, for getting lost, for having no lawyer. Her eyes were like something kept in a deep freezer for years, uncracked, unshrinking, terrifyingly still. In the gallery, an elderly woman in a faded police association baseball cap muttered loudly, not bothering to hide her voice. Still a woman, but chose to live like a dog. No wonder she doesn't even have a full shirt to wear. The people nearby nodded. One chuckled softly and turned away, like watching a dirty segment of a reality show, gross but not quite disgusting enough to protest. The apathy clung to the room like black mold sealed inside a windowless box. She sat there, surrounded by open humiliation, ice-cold insults thrown like rocks at her face, and not a single person in the system stepped in. The public defender, a white man in a wrinkled shirt and a belt barely holding together, sat to her left, tapping on his phone, never once looking at his client. When reminded that the hearing would begin in 2 minutes, he looked up, glanced at her, and let out a sigh that reeked of contempt. "You gonna plead guilty or what?" She gave no answer. She looked at him as if observing something less alive than a broken clock. After a long pause, he looked back at his screen and muttered, "What a waste of time." A few other attorneys, preparing for the next cases, turned to glance. None intervened. No one checked in. No one said, "This is going too far." No one, except her, noticed that justice had left this courtroom long ago. The judge's chair screeched as a graying white man stepped in from the side door. He didn't look at the defendant, didn't ask the prosecution any further questions, just opened the folder on his desk and flipped through the first 3 pages, like browsing a diner menu. Jane Doe, placeholder defendant name, filed due to a lack of verified identity, charged with disorderly conduct and failure to comply with dispersal orders issued by law enforcement. He read the words in a tone as flat as an old AM radio. Delray stood upright, arms folded in front of his stomach, eyes forward, half cop, half stage actor waiting for applause. There's a witness who claims the defendant shouted in the street, smashed a glass bottle, and threatened pedestrians, the judge continued. No residential address, no identification. Anything to say? Nothing. She gave no answer. She stared toward the barrier, separating the judge's bench from the aisle, where the paint had peeled away to expose rust-colored metal beneath. Still silent. No nodding, no shaking of the head, no sign of needing pity or protection. Just silence, cold, solid, and uncompromising as stone. The air in the courtroom seemed to tighten, and then a laugh cracked through it. Dry, short, sharp. Del Rey couldn't hold it in anymore. He turned to a fellow officer behind him, murmuring loud enough, "Is she mute or just doing a mime show? Thought she'd be crying, begging, maybe on her knees by now." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough to prompt a few more smirks. The judge didn't look up, didn't seem bothered. The public defender didn't flinch. They were used to it. Jokes like that. No one objected. No one called it misconduct. In this courtroom, there was no law against laughing, only a law against the poor getting angry. She looked at Del Rey for a long time. Didn't frown, didn't glare. It wasn't the look of someone burning with hate, but rather that of a security camera quietly recording, capturing, even the things no one wants to admit. Del Rey hesitated for a split second, then laughed again. The kind of laugh only someone sure of victory can manage. "All right," the judge concluded. "Hearing will resume after lunch recess. Defendant Jane Doe is to be held for 72 hours pending identification. If no one claims her, the case will be transferred to the welfare center." 3 knocks of the gavel. 1, 2, 3. Like ending an old thrift appraisal. No value, no voice, no notion of justice. As she was pulled to her feet, the dried vomit beneath the bench brushed against the hem of her coat. The stench of sourness and decay followed every step of the woman whose fate had already been decided by the room. But only she knew. This game was far from over, and those who laughed today would soon learn what silence really sounds like. She walked down the hallway toward the holding room as if every tile beneath her feet had already been counted 1,000 times in her mind. The handcuffs were still locked, red marks circling her wrists like temporary seals stamped by the system, but her steps were steady, unhurried, showing none of the anxious energy usually found in those newly remanded into custody. That calm pace felt like a challenge to the breathless onlookers, as if she were the one commanding time to slow down, so everyone could witness every detail in this silent tug-of-war between one anonymous woman and an entire system convinced it had full control. On the temporary intake record, the name field was left blank. Jane Doe, the designation reserved for every nameless woman in the National Criminal Database. A cold, emotionless, mass-produced label, like a barcode slapped onto municipal garbage bags. No one asked her name. No one truly cared whether she was Jane or not. When the court clerk extended a hand for her to sign the remand confirmation, the black ballpoint pen made a soft scratch across the paper. And there it was. A clean, confident, symmetrical signature following the exact standards of military administrative training. The kind of signature that could only be shaped by someone who had undergone high-level professional instruction, not the scribbles of an illiterate, nor the fake scrawl of an impersonator. The stroke was straight, slanted at a perfect 3 degrees, with a small finishing loop, so precise that the clerk furrowed his brow for a split second before quietly sliding the form into its folder without asking questions. He wasn't paid to doubt. He was only paid to stamp. She was taken to the mugshot room. Cold white walls, fluorescent lights embedded in the ceiling, and an old wooden chair with restraining straps bolted to its legs. The officer in charge was a bald man with a bloated belly, his surgical mask tugged below his chin, mumbling something about "these homeless ones always stinking up the place." He placed the camera on its stand, adjusted the focus, then barked his command with undisguised contempt. "Look straight into the lens. Open your eyes. Stop clamping your mouth like some stray dog poisoned by garbage." She didn't react, didn't snarl. She simply looked at him with a stare that made the entire room shrink, partly out of that the officer had to blink, partly out of discomfort, partly confusion. That gaze didn't beg, didn't burn, didn't condescend. It measured him, as if he were no longer a person, but data. When he hit the shutter, the flash didn't fire. The camera screen displayed an error message. Sensor error. Unable to connect. He tried again. Same error. He pulled the battery, reinserted it. The third time, the device shut off entirely. The whole system crashed. Frustrated, he called the technical unit. She remained seated, didn't look at the camera, didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on a tiny black spot on the wall across the room, where, under normal circumstances, a concealed security camera would be mounted. But today, it had been replaced with a strip of dull gray tape. 1 minute later, they gave up on the mugshot. "We'll do it later. Take her to holding," the bald officer grumbled. He didn't know the entire recording system had just been neutralized at a higher encryption level, triggered from within by an anonymous emergency protocol timed to perfection. She was taken to the female holding unit, a small room with no windows, 4 bleached walls, and an old blood stain near the leg of the metal bed frame. On the wall, a crooked sticky note read, "If you scream, no one hears you." She didn't read it. She had memorized that philosophy years ago, back when she still wore a uniform, still believed in something called internal justice, still thought dedication was enough to keep her from being lumped in with the wrong color, wrong class. She lay on the bed. Her hands were still cuffed in front, a technical mistake that was fully intentional, but she made no effort to escape, not yet, because everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Every reaction, every glance, every line spoken was part of the script, and she was waiting for the right moment to draw the second curtain. The female ward officer knocked on the metal door and barked. "Sit up for ID verification." A questionnaire form was slid in, along with a capless ballpoint pen. She didn't write her name, didn't fill out anything except for one line, "No permanent address." But in the field marked "Emergency Contact," she set the pen down and wrote a name in upright block letters, without punctuation, R.M. The officer's eyes twitched briefly, but he moved on. That name, if he knew it, was a nightmare for anyone who'd ever been investigated by the Federal Counterintelligence Unit. But in their database, she was still Jane Doe, still nameless, still powerless. Outside in the corridor, heavy military boots echoed like a countdown clock. No one knew whose footsteps they were, but inside the tiny cell, she had already lifted her head. Her eyes remained unchanged, cold, quiet, and razor-sharp like a blade held at a pulse point. No one noticed. Silence, not out of fear, but because she was waiting for someone to make the biggest mistake of their life. And not everyone survives thinking that this nameless woman was disposable. The next morning, Miguel stood at the far end of the female holding corridor, leaning against a peeling wooden doorframe, a cup of freshly brewed black coffee in his hand, and his eyes locked through the one-way glass. He had been observing the woman listed as Jane Doe since she was placed in the cell the previous afternoon. He was new, yes, but not the clueless kind of new. He had entered the force through a fast-track training program, with a previous internship at a federal investigative unit. He had been trained to read eyes, decode body language, and most importantly, distinguish between someone who's broken and someone who's holding back. And she, the small dark figure sitting silently behind the bars, was not broken. Miguel had seen many homeless people. He had pulled them out of storm drains, diners, parks, and sometimes morgues. They smelled. They were afraid. They trembled at the sight of handcuffs like children scared of bamboo rods. But not her. She showed no fear. She didn't shy away from eye contact. She displayed no weakness or dependency. When led away, she didn't look back. When insulted, she didn't flinch. And when called trash, she didn't respond. Not out of helplessness, but because she knew better than to waste words on those proudly standing on the wrong side of history. The more he watched, the more certain Miguel became. She didn't belong here, and she was far from nameless. Last night, Miguel had dug into the arrest file. Everything was too clean. Identity, unverified. Fingerprints, no match in any federal, state, or local criminal system. Medical records, blank. No data on psychiatric history, no prescriptions, no residential history. Even the street camera footage of the arrest was missing. The beginning and the end. Only the part where she was being subdued remained. He frowned, ran the query 3 more times, but received the same message. Archive file inaccessible. Level 2 system error. A Level 2 error wasn't small. That type of lock only occurred when someone with top-tier clearance manually sealed the data. And if so, why would a homeless person need that level of protection? She might have appeared in a previous report. McGill wasn't sure. But he recalled, during an internal briefing 2 weeks ago, about a string of suspicious fires near the district station. One drone-captured photo had shown a woman standing several meters away from the scene, face unclear, but posture identical. Thin, upright back, both hands gripping a torn cloth bag. The commanding officer had skimmed past the photo without pause, but McGill had remembered, and now, looking at her through the glass, the same silhouette resurfaced, sharp enough to raise the hairs on his arms. No ordinary person stands that straight at a disaster site. No ordinary person watches, like they're mentally mapping the escape routes of an entire city. He decided to take a risk. When he saw Lieutenant Del Rey leaving his office, Miguel intercepted him, trying to sound casual. "That homeless woman from yesterday, has she ever been arrested before?" Del Rey looked at him, his eyes gleaming with bored amusement. "Jane Doe, first time. These no-names don't usually come back. Most just disappear." Miguel nodded, but didn't walk away. "I noticed a lot of blanks in her file. No data at all." Del Rey tilted his head back and laughed, a coarse laugh, like a rusted shredder. "What are you planning to do, file a civil rights complaint? Don't be naive. Clean up the trash, stop asking questions." Then he slapped Miguel on the back, hard enough to crease his shirt. "These types don't live long enough to earn names. No point remembering them." Miguel walked away with a weight in his chest. For the first time in months, he felt caught between 2 sides. On one side, his fellow officers. On the other, something he couldn't yet name. But that clearly wasn't trash. He returned to the holding cell monitor room, staring at the surveillance feed. She was still seated, hands resting on her knees, her index finger subtly moving as if writing something. Miguel zoomed in. At that very moment, she raised her left hand toward the fluorescent light. On her palm was a reversed string of characters written in pale blue ink. Fine, even strokes, curved precisely, matching the basic mirrored script used in military encryption. Miguel held his breath. No way. No one here knew how to write like that unless they had been trained. He rushed to the data center to recheck, but found the IT audit team had sealed the entrance. System just entered scheduled maintenance. Access temporarily restricted. He said nothing, just nodded, and slowly walked back to the break room. That night, Miguel didn't sleep. He sat in his car, facing the building where she was being held. The yellow streetlight cast a faint orange tint on his hair, like the hue of someone about to cross a line. He didn't know who she was, but one thing he knew for sure. If that day he hadn't asked the question, if he had laughed along when they called her garbage, then the badge on his chest would have meant no more than the dirt caked to Del Rey's boot. And he couldn't accept that. Not after everything he'd given up to wear this uniform. Ellery Moore always knew how to make the room laugh, not with wit and certainly not with genuine humor, but with a kind of toxic half-joke, one that made cowards feel relieved they weren't the target, and gave men like him a reason to assert their status within a rotting power structure. From the very first day he was assigned as the commander of the Central District Rapid Response Force, Del Rey carried that crooked smirk like an unspoken declaration. We don't clean up trash. We erase it. No colleague questioned him, no superior cared, and no one dared to ask who he meant by trash, because everyone already knew, and everyone accepted it. In fact, he didn't just say it. He acted on it. He turned enforcement protocol into daily entertainment. Every time he arrested a homeless person, especially a person of color, he left behind a photo, crudely edited but laced with malice. He pasted their faces onto animal bodies, added sarcastic captions like "winter game meat" or "food for rats." Then he sent them into a private internal chat group, shamelessly named Street Garbage Daily. The group had over 20 members, including rookies, admin staff, and even a few mid-ranking officers. Every morning, he kicked off the day with a new meme, closing it with his signature slogan, "A clean city has no leftover memories." Leftover memories, in his view, were any human beings the system had discarded, but who still dared to exist. Last year, he was awarded the Gold Honor Badge for exceptional service in maintaining order in a high-priority district. The ceremony took place under twinkling lights, with a national flag hung against a red backdrop, and a formal speech from the police chief. Moore is a symbol of efficiency, a man who never hesitates in the line of duty. But no one mentioned that the very man being honored had once been accused of assaulting a black father in front of his 6-year-old daughter, just because the man had refused to lie face down when asked for ID in a park. Del Rey had stomped on the man's neck until he passed out. The girl screamed. Del Rey turned around, bared his teeth, and said, "I like a puppy protecting its owner." The incident was referred to Internal Affairs, then quietly closed. Insufficient video evidence. The complaint vanished from the system as if it never existed, because that day the hallway camera had, temporarily, lost signal. That story replayed the morning of Jane Doe's hearing. He entered the data administration room early, holding a coffee cup and a thick file. The technician on duty, a young employee newly assigned a few weeks prior, startled slightly when Del Rey walked in without knocking. "I need the courthouse hallway footage reset for this morning. Frame error in storage." "Order from above," Del Rey said. No explanation, no paperwork, just a rusted pen stare into the kid's face. The technician hesitated for a few seconds, but then he complied, because in this place, refusing a verbal order was often riskier than botching an official protocol. Back in the prep room before the hearing, Del Rey straightened his uniform and slicked down his thinning hair like he was prepping for a magazine shoot. He opened his phone, scrolled through the Street Garbage Daily group, and posted a new image. Jane Doe, being led away, face bowed, dim lighting. The caption read, "Today's premium trash. Might need a special truck." Within a minute, 13 reactions, 5 comments, 3 meme responses. One wrote, "Bet she slept in a drain last night." Del Rey replied with a rolling laughter emoji. He wasn't amused. He was satisfied, not by humor, but by the control, by being able to orchestrate others' reactions through the dehumanization of someone else. The kind of power he lacked in politics, in education, in character, but wielded freely in the suffocating hallways of a system no one looked too closely at. When the trial began, he was the first to stand beside her. His hand rested on the defendant's shoulder, firm enough to apply pressure, light enough to avoid accusations of excessive force, but the real weight came from his voice. When he leaned down and whispered in her ear, "If you had any dignity, you'd have ended yourself last year." Then he straightened, turned toward the crowd, and smiled like he'd just delivered a witty line at a cocktail party. What he didn't know was that every word, every step, every click of send in his chat group was composing a case file he wouldn't be able to defend once it detonated. But like all men drunk on power for too long, he mistook it for immortality. That night, after the hearing, he went home with a beer can and a folder he called his Clean Society Archive. It contained nearly 300 photos, all of people of color, homeless individuals, women, minors, and the mentally ill. Each image was labeled with a number. No names, no stories, no value preserved, except for the sick thrill of a man who believed he was taking out trash when in truth he was just burying his own conscience, one photo at a time. He thought tonight would be like every other, ending with a few likes in the Street Garbage Daily chat group, a cheap beer, and a guilt-free sleep. But on the other side of the very system he helped build, a detail, too small to show up on the radar of men addicted to low-level power, was being executed with chilling precision. While Del Rey was still retelling his historic courtroom laugh to his buddy at the station, she, the nameless woman, the one called Trash, sat in the female holding cell, leaning slightly to her left as if resting her elbow, but, in truth, hiding a quarter-folded sheet of paper pulled from inside her jacket, pressed tightly beneath her elbow. The paper was written in blue ink, strange symbols scrawled across it with no sentence structure, no connected words, just a series of disjointed characters. But anyone trained in basic encryption would instantly recognize it. Reversed ASCII, the language used in emergency communications by domestic intelligence to avoid direct tracing. She bit down gently on the paper's edge, tugging it free with the patience of someone who'd undergone hundreds of hours of anti-interrogation and psychological resistance training. She wasn't hurried. She wasn't trembling. Not a sound escaped her lips. The paper gradually disappeared between her teeth. When the final corner slipped down her throat, she swallowed, eyes unblinking. No sideways glances, but as she pushed her back against the wall, her gaze tilted ever so slightly to the right, toward a tiny black dot on the ceiling, no larger than a fingertip, a concealed camera. She knew that type well. She'd learned how to install them, how to hide them, and how to fool even high-level security systems. A faint flicker of light blinked a nearly invisible unless she knew where to look. But she saw it, and she understood. The signal had been received. Downstairs in the logistics wing, as an employee reorganized archive boxes for the weekend audit, the internal radio crackled with irregular static. Not loud, but enough for anyone familiar with tactical gear to recognize. Frequency disruption. Someone was broadcasting on a reserved channel, a channel not used for administrative communications. It was a backup line, reserved for special units, typically under federal or military intelligence. The logistics staffer froze, looked up and reached for his walkie-talkie, but stopped mid-reach. On the corner of the desk, a voice recorder no bigger than a lighter had a red light blinking, meaning someone had just triggered it manually, but this room hadn't been entered by anyone else today. While logistics scrambled to trace the disruption, she sat motionless in her cell, both hands resting on her lap. But look closely, very closely, and you'd notice her left wrist was off-center in the cuff by exactly 5 millimeters, a minuscule deviation only achievable if the lock had been set deliberately off-axis, and the wearer knew precisely how to strain their tendons to create reverse torque. The movement was hidden beneath a torn sleeve. Each time she stretched her arm, the locking pin inside the cuff bent slightly toward its breaking point. Each time she sat down, friction increased. She wasn't rushing. She knew an exposed move would destroy the mission's entire structural integrity. All she needed was one more beat. Meanwhile, Del Rey stood in the security room, puffing on a cigarette, recounting how she endured everyone's scorn without flinching. He laughed, gesturing grandly like a guest speaker at a workshop on urban waste management. A young officer asked, "Why's her file so freakishly clean?" Del Rey squinted, exhaled slowly, then replied, "'Cause they don't live long enough to have records. Got it?" The room burst into laughter. But in the corner, the secondary surveillance monitor flashed red, and no one noticed that 3 feed stations, hallway, data station, and female holding cell had simultaneously entered signal interrupted mode. She tilted her head back to the ceiling, eyes open. The flickering fluorescent bulb above blinked in uneven rhythm, like coded signals. She understood the message. The code had been received. The outside contact had activated the return transmission protocol. The radio interference was part of the emergency sequence. When an embedded agent can't transmit data, the auxiliary system scans for preloaded codes. In this case, the ASCII string she had just swallowed. Within 2 hours, if the code decrypted successfully, one of 3 responses would follow: erase the identity and extract, deploy decoy profiles to mislead, or trigger the phase shift. And she was opting for the third. Every operative had once been taught, if you must choose between voice and existence, choose strategic silence. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a stiletto hidden in the smile of the man who thought he'd already won. And tonight, that blade had been placed precisely, Just one more twist, a light one, and the cuffs would snap. All system safety language would be broken, and the ones who believed they were scripting the story would realize they'd never seen the real script at all. Every storm has that moment of silence before the wind rises, a brief second where the world seems to hold its breath, as if the air itself is being pulled out of the room to make way for something larger, more violent, and untouchable by any administrative protocol. That second arrived at 8:13 a.m. in female holding cell number 3 of the county detention facility. The fluorescent ceiling light flickered 3 times, and the sound of electric static scraped through the system like metal on human skin. She remained seated, head slightly bowed, hands on her lap. No signal, no warning. But for anyone trained in tactical response, conditioned to react instead of think, that posture was the stance before the first strike. At the exact moment the hallway officer turned his back to answer an internal call, a dry sound cracked from inside, the twist of metal, a soft break like a neck snapping, and within 4 seconds, the handcuff clamped around her left wrist burst open as if blown apart by invisible force. No tools, no violence, just wrist torque. Technique and calculations are precise down to the fraction of a second. She stood, slowly, silently. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She just walked, as if she'd been through that room 100 times. Only this time, she wasn't here to endure. In one smooth motion, her right hand slipped inside her shredded coat, once mocked by officers as a walking lice nest, and pulled out a thin, square object encased in waterproof plastic. It caught the cold light from the flickering bulb and was raised to eye level, rotated a quarter turn. Beneath the plastic, a badge, not a social services ID, not a rescue shelter permit, a real badge, officially etched, embossed, with a QR insignia in the top left corner, and 3 unmistakable bold letters, Federal Bureau of Investigation. A metallic clatter hit the floor. The sound of a Glock 19, the same sidearm Officer Delray Moore always wore on his right hip like a second limb, falling from its holster as he involuntarily stepped back. He hadn't tripped. No one pushed him. His legs simply no longer believed what his eyes were seeing. And in that vacant silence, where every gaze was locked on the woman they had all written off as waste, she took one more step. Not hurried, not shaken. Each step pressed against the peeling paint of a system that had thought itself immune to retaliation. A supervisor shouted, "Lock the door! Lock it now!" But his hand never reached the control panel. His eyes were still glued to the badge, to her eyes, to her stance. She turned slightly, holding the badge forward, then stared straight through the observation glass. The first sound after 3 days of silence slipped from her lips. Not loud, not sharp, but clear as a manifesto from the eye of a storm. "You better laugh properly, one last time." No one moved. No one breathed. The hallway, now packed with guards, fell into a suspended state, uncertain if what they felt was fear or belated realization. One man raised his radio with a trembling hand, finger jabbing the panic button, but the comm system had already been neutralized. The static from downstairs, the glitch they assumed, was a data shield, and from this moment on, nothing inside could reach the outside. The game had gone off-grid. Delray stood frozen. He didn't dare reach for his weapon, didn't dare speak, didn't dare react. He just stared, but not with the mocking stare he used to wield. This time it was the look of someone who had just realized he had made an irreparable mistake. She stepped toward him, badge still in hand, but her eyes no longer on it. Her gaze sliced through him, through his uniform, his rank, the shell of authority he had worn like armor for years. One glance shattered the mask of arrogance he'd donned since day one. He opened his mouth, maybe to ask, maybe to justify, but she gave him no room. She stopped, just 3 steps away, tilted her head slightly, lips pressed, and smiled. Not wide, not warm, not a smile one remembers fondly, but the kind of smile someone remembers fondly, but the kind of smile that said, "You have no idea who you just provoked." Behind her, the cell door clicked open, not from the panel, but via physical override. a method accessible only to high-level internal operatives. 1 second later, the siren blared, not from the standard alert system, but from a secondary line, pre-programmed for one situation only: embedded agent compromised. But as the alarm howled, no one moved, no one acted, because in that moment, truth fractured every logic they once believed in. The nameless woman, the one they called garbage, now stood at the heart of the system, holding in her hand the badge of the nightmare the uniformed ranks had always denied. And as the storm began to howl, they all understood. This wasn't a public disturbance. This was a reckoning. As the alarm faded, courtroom number 4 seemed to stretch into an unbearable stillness, collapsing into a vacuum of sound and breath. No one inhaled, no one dared blink. At the center, where just yesterday laughter, sneers, and crude jokes about the garbage woman echoed, now stood a lone figure, the nameless girl, the voiceless, the recordless. No longer clad in tattered homelessness, she stood upright in the gallery like a drawn sword. Without striking, she silenced the room. She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping across each person. Not lingering, not theatrical, but drilling into the hollow morality they wore like skin. In her right hand she held the FBI badge. With her left hand she reached into her collar and withdrew a polycarbonate mission card, frosted, triple laser bordered, embossed with the Federal Tactical Unit Code. Commander Rain Keller. Designation 19 Zulu Alpha Bravo 5, a name the justice system had been trained to treat as an internal threat protocol. Do not obstruct, do not interfere, do not err. She raised the card, eyes fixed on the overhead surveillance camera mounted atop the ceiling fan, the kind only accessible to state-level judicial security. A single beep followed by a green scan line passed over the card. The system recognized it. The credential was active. No one in the room fully grasped what they had just witnessed, but every instinct screamed, this was no longer a routine trial. This was a reverse inquisition, and they, the presumed arbiters, were now the ones on trial. At that instant, the recorder in Rain's coat pocket crackled. She paused. Her thumb swept over its surface. Signal interference, not the usual technical glitch, but an encoded jam, emitted only by counterintelligence networks. She knew someone was watching, not a superior, but someone who had been there before, who had known her identity early on and tried to prevent this too late. She didn't flinch, her lips pressed into a silent message for whoever was listening, too late. At the far end of the defendant's table, the public defender, once mocked as useless, lazy, and overweight, rose slowly. To courthouse staff, he had always been unremarkable, but now his face changed. No fatigue, no sluggishness. Every step toward Rain was measured, as if trained for this moment alone. Nearing her, he paused, unclipped his badge, and flipped it. On the back was another card bearing the internal insignia of an interagency intelligence coordination unit. The discerning ones immediately understood he wasn't a regular public defender. He was deep cover, and he had been waiting a long time for this. Without a word, Rain gave a slight nod. They understood each other, even within the system. Not all had rotted, and in that silence, the most unexpected thing happened. A court clerk, a young woman from the transcript desk, suddenly broke into tears. She didn't speak, didn't plead. She just stood there, tears falling freely, her eyes locked onto Rain. The entire courtroom stared, confused, until she choked out one line, "You saved my daughter." In the Holly case 2 years ago, the room exploded, not with noise, but with the silent shattering of assumptions. The Holly case. The little girl was abducted from an elementary school in the neighboring district. Everyone thought it had been a SWAT success, but the first to find the girl was an undercover agent, identity withheld. Now, they knew. No one said. Everyone, from clerks to staff to guards, rose. No command was given, but, like instinct, hats were removed, badges were pocketed, and eyes were lowered, not from fear, but from surrender. A surrender not performed, not televised, not rehearsed. A surrender to the woman once called trash, once spat upon, once dragged to the bottom of the system, now standing above them, with no weapon, no authority, just her presence. Del Rey still hadn't picked up his gun. His hands trembled, not from fear of firing, but because, for the first time, he no longer knew who he was. Inside the system he thought he controlled. Rain turned, glanced at him, not with hate, not with triumph, just as if looking at a tool that had lost its use. And as that gaze passed, he bowed his head. For the first time in his arrogant law enforcement career, his chin touched his chest, not from pressure, but because he knew he had just lost the only thing he had left, meaningful existence. Rain stood there, in the very room designed to make her bow her head, and yet now it was the room where every eye had to look up to see her. The silence no longer belonged to shock. It was the silence of a room stripped bare of illusion, its power dynamic shattered, now staring into a truth no one had been prepared to face. She did not raise her voice, did not brandish a weapon, did not grandstand. She merely unzipped her jacket, and from inside she pulled out a waterproof map, folded tight and hidden within the lining, sliding it free with 2 fingers. No one spoke, but when she pinned the map onto the whiteboard, usually reserved for procedural charts, the room froze in place. A city map, 8 red marks. Each mark indicated a public space where a disappearance had occurred. All victims were black. None older than 30, none with criminal records. None received more than a single round of media coverage, and in all 8 cases, the one detail absent from public records, but quietly noted in internal response reports, was a name: Del Rey Moore, first responder, area lead, on scene every time. Rain did not raise her tone. She simply pointed at each red dot with a black marker and crossed them off, one by one. 33 months ago, Milton Park, a girl named Annalise, called 911 after spotting an unconscious man, disappeared right after. Moore was first on scene, filed no report. 1 strike. 22 months ago, West Hill Central parking lot, a black woman detained for disturbing security. No name logged. Moore was on duty. Another strike. She went on, monotone, steady, but each line peeled back another layer of flesh from the system's skeleton. 11 months ago, District 4 Town Hall. Fire. Official report: electrical fault. Reality: deliberate arson targeting personnel records of the Internal Oversight Division. First to respond: me. Her eyes didn't flinch. I nearly died in that fire, was transferred under a false ID and hospitalized for 22 days. She didn't add that the oxygen in her ER tank had been mistakenly replaced with inert gas, or that her medical files were erased from 3 separate databases within a week. She didn't need to. The room understood. Mistakes like that don't happen by accident. Del Rey now stood rigid, sweat rolling down his temple despite the running A/C. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Everything Rain said he knew was true. He had once called it a cleansing campaign, told a close aide, if the black ones don't die by bullets, they'll die because no one remembers their names. But now every forgotten name was returning, not through headlines, not through protests, but through one person strong enough to speak them out loud. Time, place, evidence, all of it. She turned to the corner of the map and pointed to a code string, an internal FBI designation for Tier 3 anti-corruption infiltration ops. I was embedded here 14 months ago. Mission: trace internal protection networks tied to record suppression, evidence tampering, and disappearance of personnel files tied to race, especially in lower court jurisdictions. She didn't read the bottom line of the directive, the one that confirmed Del Rey Moore as a red-level target, the tier that, if not captured within 24 months, required full extraction of the unit to prevent further losses. But Rain had not extracted. She stayed. She let herself be cold garbage, let herself sit beside dried vomit under the courtroom bench, let herself be cuffed in rusted steel, let the recording device be scrambled, let herself be kicked in the ribs while being walked down a hallway with no cameras. She had remained silent, not from weakness, but because only in silence can a hunter hear the footsteps of prey. And now she said, all data on this map has been backed up under interagency protocol. If I am harmed or disappeared, 7 minutes later it gets uploaded to the Federal Press Network. She didn't threaten, didn't provoke. She simply stated it as fact. And in that room, no one saw her as homeless anymore. She was the storm they hadn't predicted, and that storm was already stripping the veneer from every layer of this system. The officers standing at the courtroom perimeter were quickly ordered to seal all exits. Within 10 seconds, the entire courthouse was locked down like a steel trap. No one in, no one out. From the west hallway came the echo of military boots striking marble, like the footsteps of justice returning. A team of 8 in jet-black tactical gear appeared, jackets bearing the reflective stripes of the FBI. Each carried elite credentials, weapons, and data extraction tools. They didn't greet. They didn't announce. They entered like every person in that courtroom owed them an answer, and they did. The security sergeant who had laughed when Rain entered that morning turned pale at the sight of their insignia. He backed away, too late. One agent walked up, presenting an emergency summons. No explanation, no negotiation. He was told to surrender his badge and weapon, then escorted out. An echo of the authority he once believed was his alone. Now, he was the evidence. The rot in the system wasn't hiding anymore. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. No more whispers, no more smug laughter. Rain turned, and her eyes no longer held restraint. They were sharp with certainty, with the knowledge of exactly who needed to fall. She stepped to the bench without waiting for permission. Her voice cut the room like a honed blade. 3 people in this room who thought they stood above the law have been marked. 1 forged records, 1 coordinated courtroom manipulation to shield abusers, and the 3rd fed names for targeted witness suppression. She turned toward the FBI team. They're here, and I will name them. The air congealed, breathing stalled. Rain lifted her hand, steady, unwavering. She pointed directly at a salt-and-pepper-haired officer pretending to jot notes. Detective J. Monahan, the man who had led an illegal raid on the home of an elderly black witness, resulting in her death. She didn't need to say his name. He stood, roaring in protest, but the agents didn't wait. 2 moved in, twisted his arms behind his back, and slammed him onto the desk, just as he'd done to so many innocents. The second was a blonde officer who had once overseen witness protection, but had deleted elevator footage showing a woman named Latrice being assaulted. Rain locked eyes with her. That was all. One agent activated a projection from his wristwatch, the deleted clip restored. The woman froze. No one cuffed her. She bowed her head, unpinned her badge, and placed it on the desk. Surrender without ceremony. The third, a young officer by the door, showed no expression, but his eyes darted wildly. Rain didn't look at him. She glanced at the display behind her. A tap on the screen. His name surfaced. He had leaked internal documents, addresses, routines, names of those who had filed abuse complaints, people who later suffered accidents. He bolted, but the doors were sealed. He screamed, the first real sound to tear the courtroom stillness. No one moved. Only cold steel cuffs responded. Rain didn't smile, didn't gloat. She delivered one sentence that hung like a suspended verdict. I don't need you imprisoned. I need your truths dragged into daylight. That's what you can't survive. A second later, internal courtroom cameras were redirected to live stream to the federal data hub. Every blink, gesture, and utterance was encoded and transmitted under evidence priority level alpha. No escape, no gray areas. And Rain, she stepped off the bench as if she'd never wept, never been struck down. Her posture wasn't proud. It was the stance of someone who had learned to survive collapse and still stare power in the eye. The silence thickened, not with fear, but with the realization that this system had backed the wrong side. Inside, the links began to break, not because Rain screamed, but because she had stood still long enough for the untouchables to crack in the mirror of their own conscience. She didn't look back. When the rear door clicked shut, the sound of the steel bolt locking into place, Rain walked as if there was nothing left to prove. But those who knew her well understood. That was when she was most dangerous, because when she went silent, The old wounds began to draw their blades from within. The western surveillance room of the federal complex where Rain now sat was entirely sealed off from the outside world. The one-way glass allowed her to observe without being seen. In front of her, 3 screens projected the faces she had named less than an hour ago. Each expression was a living specimen of systemic decay, but Rain didn't look at them like prey. She looked at them like someone who had once been crushed under their gaze. A tap, the screens went dark. The room fell into the dim silence of memory. She closed her eyes, and, as always, memory needed no invitation. That day at Quantico, the training grounds were bathed in early summer sun. Rain was still young, her uniform was crisp, her heart still naively believed that talent and resolve were enough to earn fairness. But that day's drill wasn't about tactics. It was about power, the kind that never appears in manuals. 3 men, 2 field agents and 1 direct superior, had singled her out. She didn't know why. Maybe because she was a woman. Maybe because of her skin. Maybe because she didn't laugh when they mocked reports from black victims. The reason was never spoken, but the consequences were. They shoved her into the equipment room. No cameras, a punch to the ribs, a shove that slammed her back into a metal rack, a cigarette-stained voice sneering beside her ear, "If you can't handle this, how'll you survive real work, rookie?" And finally, the laughter. Not joyful, but the laughter of men who knew no one would defend her. Rain filed no report. She went for x-rays alone, learned to smile while walking on crutches down the corridor, and at the internal hearing, they asked, were there any witnesses? No. She had been the only one in the room, and the only one left with a file stamped insufficient evidence. Years later, she returned to the force, not as standard personnel, but as a federal coordinator. I handle internally linked federal cases, no name, no rank, no badge, only a code. She chose the bottom, because that's where everything sinks, and from there she watched. She watched the system digest truth with protocol, saw redacted reports, technical error footage. She saw the faces that went on TV talking about ethics, and in rare moments alone with old files, she saw the names of the 3 from today, once colleagues, once mentors, once the reason she stopped believing in justice by rhetoric. She could have sought revenge long ago, but she waited, not out of weakness, but because she knew that personal payback wouldn't rattle the system. She needed it to collapse under its own buried truths, and when the moment came, she didn't rise as a victim. She rose as the final witness. A knock. The lead inspector entered. No greeting, no smile, but his eyes had changed. Once doubtful, now unable to deny. They're being interrogated. 1 confessed. 2 are in isolated holding. We found data from 11 cases on that young officer's laptop. Rain nodded. No follow-ups. The man stared at her for a while, then said quietly, "I used to think you were stubborn. Turns out, you're just someone who never forgets." She turned, smiling for the first time, but it wasn't warm. It was the cold gleam of someone who had survived. Sometimes, to fix a system, you don't need to be a hero, just the one who never looks away from the crack. She left. She stood, gazing through the one-way glass. Officers were tidying up the courtroom. No one looked toward her, and that was enough. She never needed to be known, only to be truly seen. In the top corner of the screen, an internal bulletin blinked, brief and clinical. 3 senior officers suspended, criminal investigation initiated, department launches ethical systems review. Rain stared at the line like it was a reflection of herself. No flair, no applause, no name in the headline. But she didn't need it, because now the world understands. Justice wears no cape. Sometimes it just wears scars and memory. And there are those born to be the final broken link, in silence, but never in shadow. Then Rain saw a tiny flicker in the lower right corner. A coded internal signal only those with top secret clearance would recognize. She didn't blink, but something stirred within her. Not alarm, a reply. The door to the coordination room opened, this time without a knock. A tall young man stepped in. Hair trimmed close, eyes bright but guarded, internal affairs uniform, ID tag clipped askew on his chest. No one had paid him attention earlier, nor when he slipped away toward the tech bay as the courtroom spiraled into chaos, but now he entered like a punctuation mark, meticulously placed after a string of unanswered questions. "Miguel," Rain said softly. No doubt, no need for confirmation. He smiled, not a pleasantry, but the knowing smile of someone who had spent long enough in the shadows to tell who was real and who was performing. "All devices are synced," he said, voice low and steady. "They've lost all internal comms. You won, Rain." She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes held him, as if she were rereading a chapter from a book long set aside. Because months ago, when Rain first walked into that precinct as an unnamed internal consultant, Miguel had been one of the first to approach, not with suspicion, but with the look of someone who knew what it meant to live inside a disguise. No one knew he was an FBI agent, not even Rain at the time. Not until he sent her a recording from a closed-door meeting where Delray, the same high-ranking officer once praised in the press for anti-drug leadership, had used his precinct office to hand off case files to a Mexican drug lord. That was when Rain understood she wasn't alone. Miguel didn't speak often, but his story unfolded through data. Once a top cadet at the academy, he'd been reassigned to local precincts for field experience. The truth? He had uncovered ties between a clique of FBI supervisors and a human trafficking syndicate. A month later, his car exploded outside his home. He survived, but from then on, his name vanished from official rosters. He existed only in deep-level databases with a single role, internal observer. He returned the only way criminals never suspect, by becoming one of them. The first time I saw Delray lean over to sign that falsified arrest log, I saw the ghost of the same system that tried to burn down my family, Miguel said without flinching. But I needed proof, and I needed you. Rain sat. Her gaze softened, but just for a beat. "Why me? There were hundreds who could have done this." Miguel chuckled faintly. "Because you didn't break when no one believed you. Because when the system told you to forget, you chose to remember. And because, I know, only those pushed to the edge truly understand that justice isn't written in law, it's written in truth." A strange quiet hung between them, not awkwardness, alignment. Miguel opened his tablet. Data filled the screen. Photos, audio clips, financial transfers, and GPS routes. He zoomed in on one frame. Delray, in a car, speaking to a man identified as Armando Rivas, the cartel boss behind the pipeline from El Paso to San Bernardino. Timestamp just 3 weeks ago. "We're looking at a federal indictment," Miguel said, no longer deferential, but resolute. "But I need your signature on the chain of custody. You initiated this operation." Rain paused, then nodded. "Do it." Miguel turned to leave, but stopped. "There's something you don't know," he said, voice dipping. "Last week, Delray sent someone to my mother's house, posing as a technician. They planted an explosive device in the water heater." Rain's hands clenched. "Is she?" "She's alive. I moved her the moment I detected signal disruption from her home. But it was a message, for me, that they know who I am, and I won't let them get a second chance." Rain's eyes no longer belonged to a survivor. They belonged to someone preparing to end it. "Then, Miguel, we're out of time." He nodded. No further words. As the door shut behind him, Rain opened a new file. On the cover, a single handwritten word in red ink. Genesis, the beginning. No one expected the young internal officer, once dismissed as an admin filler, to be the blade beneath the cuff. And no one expected the black woman, once left crumpled on a supply room floor, to be the one forcing an entire system to bow to the light. And the most unexpected truth of all, that the ones buried deepest in shadow were the only ones willing to flip the switch. The monitor in the surveillance room still cast its pale light as Rain stood up, but outside, the world had already changed. What she and Miguel had orchestrated in silence was now beginning to echo through the system. Not sirens, but fractures, thin cracks, but irreversible ones. That afternoon, At a small cafe near Columbia University, a law student named Cami stumbled upon a 13.5-minute video uploaded by an anonymous account. The title was almost crude in its simplicity: Justice Inside the Walls, Full Footage. Like many in her generation, Cami had long stopped believing in textbook justice, but the moment she clicked play, every definition she'd ever been taught ignited into ashes. The video opened with Rain stepping to the center of the courtroom, harsh white light reflecting off eyes that never blinked. Then came the accusations, the exposed officers, the unraveling expressions, each second turning truth into a blade that peeled away the system's masks. 13.5 minutes, no effects, no narration. But within 6 hours of its upload, the phrase, "badge from the streets," had become the #1 trend across American social media. No one knew who typed it first, but it spread like a match to dry grass. An entire generation seemingly waiting for permission to ignite. People were wrongfully arrested, parents who lost children to baseless warrants. Workers were harassed for the color of their skin. Memories buried long ago now clawed back, not for display, but confrontation. And Rain, who had never appeared on television, became a symbol, not manufactured by media, but forged by survival, because no one can fake the gaze of someone who lived. Epoch Justice published an emergency bulletin the next morning. FBI launches full-scale probe into Delray Police Department. Over 11 cases flagged for human rights violations and evidence tampering. A federal spokesperson appeared at an 8 a.m. press briefing. Anyone referenced in the video will be subpoenaed. No rank excluded, no immunity granted. As major outlets amplified the hashtag, online communities began tracing every face shown in the footage. They unearthed forgotten cases previously dismissed as insufficient evidence. They uncovered archived photos, buried testimonies, and backup drives salvaged from a former data intern's laptop. Each piece a shard of glass, now forming a complete mosaic, a decayed system, one strike away from collapse. And that strike was a woman who never asked to be spoken for. In a 6th-floor meeting room at FBI headquarters in D.C., senior officials silently watched real-time analytics. A heat map revealed that in 36 hours, the video had been downloaded over 4 million times, shared more than 800,000, and generated over 50 million discussions. But not just in America. From Cape Town to Seoul, Rio to Paris, people weren't just condemning, they were remembering. Injustice knows no border. And now, a symbol of resilient defiance had a name: Rain. A senior media advisor whispered, "We no longer control the narrative. If we don't act, the system itself will be seen as complicit." The director of internal security didn't respond. He simply lifted the phone and called the investigative command. "Move Delray's file to federal indictment. Release everything, no redactions." At the Delray precinct, reporters swarmed the gates from dawn. Each officer exiting the building was hounded with questions. "What do you think of the video? Were you involved with Rain's case? Is your file being audited?" No one answered. Some tried to smile, some hid beneath caps, but their eyes said what words could not. The system no longer shielded them. On the FBI's official Twitter feed, a stark white background bore a single post at 10:07 a.m. "Justice is not a badge. It's a burden we carry. And today, we answer for it." Rain didn't post anything, didn't speak, but a photo of her leaving the courtroom, shoulders squared, eyes forward, sunlight cutting across her unpainted face, became the profile picture for thousands of accounts. They used it to speak their fatigue, their fury, their trust long betrayed. And as Badge from the Streets was turned into banners, printed on shirts, sprayed on walls, and even titled a viral rap song within 72 hours, the system realized it was no longer up against a person. It was facing a collective memory, a leaderless movement with too many reasons to stop. But it was in that moment, when the architecture of power began to crack, that those once above the law felt something unfamiliar, fear, not of the courts, of the light, because for so long they had thrived in the dark, and Rain, once a name no one remembered, became the one thing they could never forget. The system didn't collapse, but it began to wheeze, to audit itself, to amputate the rot to survive, and for the first time, an unprecedented shift occurred. Rain's personnel file, once flagged as too opaque for promotion, was reopened, not to disqualify, but to learn. A system was cracking, and a woman, once exiled from it, was the first to force it to reckon with its conscience. But some cracks weren't consequences, they were fingerprints, echoes, of a past never given a name. 2 days after the hearing, Rain returned to the FBI's records archive, not to rest, but to trace. She knew what had surfaced was only the tip of a rotten mass. Del Rey, with all his power and arrogance, couldn't have just tampered with evidence. It couldn't be just a man with shaky recordings and a handful of deals with drug lords. She needed what had silenced an entire system, and she found it. In a deeply encrypted directory labeled with meaningless characters, Rain opened a file scrubbed from the public index. Its title, Operation Veilstone. Inside were 2 death reports, both ruled accidental. But the moment she read the first line, she knew these weren't accidents. These were executions, and the man who shielded the killer was Del Rey. Victim 1, Malcolm Price, black, male, 17. Arrested on suspicion of car theft, though surveillance footage proved he wasn't near the scene. 12 hours later, Price was found dead in his cell, with ligature marks on his neck, though the report claimed cardiac arrest due to allergic reaction. Rain scrutinized every redacted testimony, every clipped sentence. But what froze her breath was the final line. Malcolm Price, half-brother of Desmond Cale, front-runner for state senate in the East District. Victim 2, Santiago Ruiz, a Mexican-American maintenance worker, found dead in the third-floor archives of the precinct. Official cause, fall from ladder while servicing overhead lights. But the crime scene photos showed blood splatter on the wall, a shattered corner from external force. Her instincts, honed by field scars, told her this was witness silencing. Santiago had sole access to the internal security footage from the night Malcolm was killed. He vanished a week later. She printed the files, sealed them in an envelope, and handed them to Miguel. "This is the root fracture," she said. "Everything else was just paint." Miguel froze at the sight of Desmond Cale's name. "If this comes out, this won't be criminal justice. This will be a political earthquake. And if it doesn't come out," Rain stared directly at him, "then the justice we serve is nothing more than polish for a rotting machine." That afternoon, Desmond Cale received a call. No ID, no greeting, just a single question through static. "Have you ever asked why your brother died?" Cale stood. His voice cracked. "Who is this?" "The only one who remembers who Malcolm was. And I don't need your vote. I just need your silence to end." The line disconnected. But 3 hours later, Cale's campaign office issued a press statement. "We formally request the Department of Justice and Federal Internal Affairs to reopen the death investigation of Malcolm Price. All evidence will be made public, no exception." The story spread like wildfire. News outlets dropped scheduled segments to focus on the Del Rey Police Department's alleged cover-up murders. Del Rey became the most searched name within 24 hours. More importantly, netizens began digging into other suspicious local deaths. A new wave surged. Veilstone files, each post a photo, a shadowed corner, an unanswered question. Inside the FBI, senior advisors felt the heat, not only from facts, but from fury. They had never seen a tide this fierce, leaderless, centerless, yet powerful enough to topple chairs if mismanaged. In a closed-door meeting, one oversight board member exhaled sharply. "Rain Carter has become something we can't control. Worse yet, she's right." And Del Rey, still unapprehended, vanished, no trace, but Rain knew his type. He wasn't fleeing, he was coiling. And this time what he would strike wasn't just her, it was the truth she held. Miguel received an anonymous message on his private server. She should shut up. No one wants the past dug up. Attached was a photo of his mother's house, taken from behind the security fence. Rain read the message. Her eyes no longer sought justice. They braced for war. The old fractures, they weren't hidden anymore. They were spreading, vivid, permanent. The next morning, an official announcement went live. Del Rey was suspended indefinitely. His internal accounts were frozen, all access privileges, especially codes he had authored, revoked. On paper, it was the end of a career, but Rain knew better. Men like him didn't lose power when they lost position. They just became more dangerous, and she wasn't the only one who understood. In a dim corner of a bar reserved for veterans and cops, 5 men gathered where jazz played loud enough to bury conversation. Among them, 3 had served with Del Rey in the Rapid Response Unit back in 2009. One was the department's current IT coordinator. The last, a former officer suspended during the Black Lives Matter protests for excessive force. The silver hazel one spoke first, his voice sliced cold and flat like a blade. She wants to unravel everything we've protected. No, another scoffed, pouring whiskey with a glint of rage in his eyes. She wants to make examples out of us, like justice is just some hashtag game. On the table sat a stack of printed documents. No header, no signature, but within, photos of Rain, sealed academic records, and an old file noting her 6-month suspension for refusing a superior's order on a covert mission. They didn't care about context, only vulnerability. "We push her into the light," said one, "not because she's wrong, but because she dared to be right where no one's allowed to be." The campaign started through anonymous blogs. Ghost accounts whispered tales of Rain's murky history. Some claimed ties to known criminals in exchange for intel. Others showed her dining with a journalist, accused of taking lobby money. Each post ended with the same question: is this who we're celebrating, or a PR construct built to fracture law enforcement? But what hit hardest was a letter sent to Miguel, neatly typed, watermarked with a forged federal seal. It read, "We will never let something like her touch our foundation. When a badge falls, we rebuild with blood." Miguel gave it to Rain in silence. She read it, folded it. No surprise. She'd been waiting. The only unknown was how they'd begin. That night, her social media was hacked. Within 4 minutes, a fake post appeared. "I'm sorry for betraying the Brotherhood. I was never clean enough to wear the badge." Though deleted within 5, screenshots flooded timelines. Right-wing outlets pounced, using it to question her credibility. "They're targeting the image," Miguel said. "They can't distort the truth, so they're trying to distort you." Rain didn't rage, but she felt cold. Not fear, but clarity. This wasn't an investigation anymore. It was an information war. And whoever controlled public emotion controlled the verdict. The next morning, a group of anonymous officers announced their withdrawal from the Bureau, citing the FBI's politicization of policing. They didn't name her. By afternoon, a news network rebroadcast courtroom footage, this time edited. The evidence was cut. All that remained were officers being taken away. In Rain's quote, "I don't need them jailed. I need their truths dragged into the light." Comments swerved. Who is she to decide what gets exposed? Is this justice or a witch hunt? Rain understood. Badges weren't symbols of law anymore. They were battlegrounds of fear, loyalty, and belief. And if someone didn't fit the ideology of those who control, they'd be cast out at any cost. Back in her office, a silent envelope waited. No name. Inside, a photo of her old apartment. Scrawled across the bottom in jagged ink, "Everyone has shadows. Keep yours," instead of lighting the room. She held the photo, unblinking. Miguel entered, caught the look in her eyes, and he knew they'd declared war. A badge? To Rain, it had never been a prize, but now it wasn't even a seat, it was a line, and she wasn't backing down. Monday morning, the FBI headquarters glowed gray through bulletproof glass. In a small room on the 8th floor, Rain sat alone. Before her lay an internal report, attached to a recommendation, temporarily withdraw from the investigation due to personal safety concerns. Below it, bold text read, "Recommendation based on real threat level and potential media crisis." She read to the final line. No smile, no page turn, no signature. She simply placed the paper down and leaned back in her chair. And then Rain began to speak, not to anyone, but as if in conversation with the ideals that had kept her alive for 2 decades. Freedom doesn't mean everyone will like me. Freedom is standing in the middle of a crowd that wants to tear me apart and still saying what no one wants to hear. She closed her eyes. Images returned, the sneer from her old commander, Malcolm Price's shallow breaths in the deleted surveillance footage, Del Rey's smug grin walking past Santiago Ruiz's body, the silent faces in court, not ignorant, but willfully blind. They're not afraid of the truth. They're afraid of having to look at it too long. Because the truth isn't a slogan. It comforts no one. It doesn't shield. It strips off the disguise and asks, "Now what?" McGill knocked softly and entered. In his hands, a new case file, untouched. But instead of placing it on the desk, he sat across from her, quietly, then said gently, "You don't have to do this alone." Rain looked up, her gaze cutting through the heavy air. "No one walks this road beside me, Miguel, but they can follow if I don't fall." She knew, after today, every move would be tracked, every step twisted, every word sliced, branded and displayed as confession. But some vows, once spoken, weren't for pride. They were for survival. "I was once an officer, once wore the badge like it was a shield of honor, but I learned a badge doesn't save you from betrayal, and it won't stop you from betraying yourself." That night, when Rain arrived at her apartment, a gray pickup truck idled 15 meters from her door, headlights off, engine humming. No plates. No one stepped out. She didn't stop, just glanced for a second, then climbed the stairs as if nothing had happened. In her mailbox, a thin envelope. Inside, a photo from 2002, her in desert fatigues in Iraq, hugging a frail Iraqi boy. On the back, in red ink, "Someone like you shouldn't survive." She pinned the photo to her fridge, not to remember, but to remind herself, if they wanted her afraid, they picked the wrong woman. The next day, she walked into the FBI director's office unannounced. Her hand clenched the case file, and her voice was no longer a request. It was a declaration. "I'm not stepping down. I'm not signing. I'm not backing off. If someone thinks I'm a media liability, scrap the media. And if this system sees my presence as a threat, maybe the system needs new blood." No one spoke for 3 full minutes, not out of respect, but because there was no counter-argument for someone with nothing left to lose, except her conviction. That night, independent news outlet New Equity TV aired a clip from Rain's internal hearing 2 weeks earlier. No one knew who leaked it, but it spread like wildfire. In it, she said, "I don't want anyone to remember my name. But if they must, let them remember I didn't choose silence, even when silence was the safest option." The comments section is split into 2. One side called her a dangerous blaze, the other, the last remaining light. She replied to none. She simply chalked one line on her office wall. "Freedom is not a privilege. It is a debt paid in every form of endurance." And Rain, the woman once beaten, ousted, defamed, now sat at the storm's center, not to dodge, but to force the system to look back at itself. When freedom becomes the enemy, then the existence of someone who won't bow becomes the most lethal strike. And Rain, from now on, was no longer just one person. She was a living reminder that justice isn't granted, it must be reclaimed. But the cost of that reminder was silence paid in blood. 2 days after the leaked speech, a witness named Tyler Baines, 19 years old, a former part-time security trainee at the Delray precinct, decided to step into the light. Against a black backdrop and a live stream from a temporary dorm, his voice trembled but stayed firm. I saw Delray issue a verbal order to alter the internal report on Malcolm Price's death. I signed the document per my supervisor's instruction, even though I knew it was false. In just 12 hours, the video had been shared over 500,000 times. Tyler became Rain's symbolic successor, but within 12 more hours, he disappeared. Phone, unreachable. GPS, offline. Dorm room door, no sign of forced entry. Hallway cameras, suddenly grainy. Alarm system, untriggered. The last person seen beside Tyler before the signal vanished, a man in a gray suit. No badge, no entry logs. Rain knew this wasn't intimidation anymore. This was war, and it struck at the most vulnerable target. The next morning, she appeared outside FBI headquarters. No coat, no sunglasses, no layers of caution as usual. Media outlets, long used to snapping her from a distance, fell quiet as she walked directly toward them, early light casting across her bare, unflinching face. My name is Rain Carter, personnel ID F689. I initiated the Delray investigation. I released the Veilstone documents. And I am the agent the FBI has asked to temporarily withdraw from this operation for safety concerns. Today, I say no. Every word hit like a hammer striking the system's blind spot. No more shadows. No more intermediaries. She went public, claimed full responsibility, stepped forward, like a moving target in open fire. Tyler Baines didn't vanish by choice. And if someone like him can risk everything to speak up, then I, with my badge, my file, my clearance, have no excuse to hide behind a label of special protection. The press conference clip spread rapidly. Major outlets could no longer ignore it. They were forced to air it in full. Across platforms, the hashtag #WhereIsTyler surged. Student groups launched grassroots search networks. A new site emerged, documenting every trace, every timestamp, every potential witness. A right-wing publication dropped an op-ed titled, "Mockingly, When an FBI Agent Becomes an Activist." But this time, the backlash didn't favor them. In the comments section, a retired police officer wrote, "Maybe she didn't follow protocol, but for the first time in years, I see someone willing to stand in the storm without bowing." The article was flagged for ethical distortion within an hour. A takedown campaign gained momentum. When the publication refused, thousands of subscribers canceled. Their content editor was forced into the spotlight, issuing a public apology. "We misjudged the true weight of this justice wave." The Internal Affairs Office initially remained silent, but public pressure surged. The next morning, a federal spokesperson was forced to appear on national television with a firm statement. "We have no evidence indicating that Tyler Baines voluntarily left his place of residence. We are treating the incident as a criminally suspicious disappearance." Simultaneously, the office's internal record system was compromised. Leaking an email marked urgent, the content read, "No one is to contact Rain privately until written instructions are issued." That line spread like a clear signal that the system was trying to lock its own doors before they could be blown open from the inside. And Rain, instead of stepping back, went even more public. She released every email, meeting minute, and note from internal interactions over the past 3 months. All of it was encrypted and shared on an open-source platform where the public could verify, comment, and trace everything back. Each time a user opened a file, a warning appeared. "This data is provided not for your trust, but for your verification." The platform garnered over 30 million visits within the first 48 hours. A renowned university immediately launched a seminar titled "Decoding Rain: When Evidence Redefines Trust." Miguel stepped into the office, handing her a fresh printout, a CCTV snapshot. A figure, unknown, in the parking lot of headquarters, standing next to Rain's car. On the windshield, a single red handprint. Not broken, not pried, just left behind, like a message, "You're next." Forensics experts confirmed The handprint did not match any data in the National Archive. An anonymous hacker quickly reconstructed the remaining camera angle and discovered the figure was looking directly into the lens, as if fully aware they were being filmed. The image spread across the internet with a single caption, "When darkness starts fearing the light." She looked at the photo, then turned and wrote into the internal memo, "I am not requesting protection. I am requesting continuation." That sentence appeared instantly on the home pages of several international news outlets. One major newspaper dubbed it the first data-driven declaration of war in modern media history. In the hallway outside, a row of law students sat quietly, each carrying a case file that had once been dismissed by courts connected to Del Rey. They chanted no slogans, held no live streams. They simply read through each file as if returning a voice to names once erased from the records. When a system fears voices, it turns silence into its hiding place. But for Rain, silence was no longer a refuge. It was a front line. She did not retreat, she did not deflect, and she assumed no one was automatically an ally. Those who had sought to leverage her name for political campaigns were all rejected. She chose to be interviewed by a small, independent radio station, where the first question was not, "How do you feel?" but "Who did nothing while knowing?" The cost of silence is not death. It is the continuation of lies. And she, at all costs, would not let it continue. He raised his head and stared straight ahead, as if the entire courtroom was still under his control. The jury seats were full. Federal security agents stood on both sides. The counsel tables were packed. Television cameras were mounted from the ceiling corners, and in the center stood Rain. No slogans, just a female undercover agent, standing in the courtroom, her gaze cold as steel, hands steady, lips unpursed, and when her voice rang out, each word sounded as if carved from stone. Start from section 24. Timestamp. 2:12 a.m. The sound echoed through the courtroom. A video clip appeared on the projection screen. It was not edited, no cuts, just a direct excerpt from the internal surveillance system, the very system Del Rey once believed was there to protect him. But here, it became the ultimate witness. On screen, a man in an FBI uniform slammed a stack of files onto a desk and hissed through his teeth, "If that girl's still alive tomorrow, I'm out of a job." No one in the room said a word, but not because there were no reactions. Rather, there were too many, colliding in silence. A reporter live streaming the trial dropped his microphone to the floor. Not out of clumsiness, but because his hands were shaking too hard to hold it. The camera trembled for a moment, then refocused. Zooming in on the exact moment, Del Rey tilted his head and curled his lips into that all-too-familiar smirk. Del Rey sneered. He showed no sign of losing composure, only turned to the jury with a look of disdain. "These kinds of videos, huh? They're all about setting up stunts now." In that moment, one juror, a black woman, once nearly a victim in a rigged case from the year 2015, removed her glasses, wiped them with the hem of her shirt, but did not put them back on. She did not need a clearer view. She only needed to remember the face of this man, the face of someone who had just buried himself before the cameras, not with rage, but with a laugh at the worst possible time. At the same moment, the video clip was instantly duplicated into hundreds of versions across social media. A prominent account tweeted, "If that girl's still alive," were the words of a federal agent, but the one who said nothing, who did not intervene, who offered no objection, was the presiding judge. The hashtag Del Rey knew and stayed silent reached over 500,000 shares within 30 minutes. A looping gif of Del Rey nodding and looking at the jury with hollow eyes was overlaid with the caption, "Laughing over someone else's blood." In the back row, a lawyer who had once been removed from the public defender roster by Del Rey for lacking the resolve to uphold order, whispered to a colleague, "He still thinks this is his stage." But today, the audience has switched sides. The colleague gave a slight nod, eyes not on the screen, but on the small side plaque of the projector, where Del Rey's name had once been embossed in gold, now covered by a strip of black tape. An elderly police officer in a faded uniform clenched the strap of his cap, then silently stood and exited the courtroom. He had once taken a photo with Del Rey during a campaign titled Law and Justice back in the year 2016. But today, seeing that face again in the footage, he knew he had stood on the wrong side. Outside the courtroom, a group of law students pasted a printed quote, "If that girl's still alive," alongside a still image of Del Rey on the glass wall. Not to protest, but to remind passers-by, power does not need guns. The right silence at the right time is enough to destroy a person. And among it all, Rain still stood, requiring no elaboration, her expression unchanged, but her gaze sliced through Del Rey like it was stripping away each layer of defense he had wrapped around himself. The camera slowed down at that precise moment, and the national broadcast left nothing on the cutting room floor. They kept every raw second, as if to force every viewer to ask themselves, if you were in that room, would you bow your head or look straight ahead? He opened his mouth, wearing a smile that was no longer a weapon but a reflex of someone who had been let off too many times. These kinds of videos? Huh? They like to stage things nowadays. Rain did not respond. She merely nodded to the technician. The screen changed. An audio recording. A faint female voice played, "He told me to stay silent. If I still wanted to live." The entire room fell silent. Rain did not look at the screen, nor at anyone else. She stood upright, her hand resting on a thick stack of paper files, as heavy as a verdict, tailored for Del Rey. Source documents verified. Recording device seized from the 12th witness's apartment. The device was encrypted, authenticated by 3 independent laboratories, and fully sealed. Forensic signatures were submitted yesterday. The presiding judge leaned forward. "Mr. Del Rey, any objections?" He propped his elbows on the table, clasped his hands as if meditating in a dungeon, then smirked. "I have only one thing to say. If justice is a game of who has the most recordings, then this isn't a court, it's a stage. And you're the only actor who thinks he's immortal." Rain's voice wasn't loud, but it pierced the air like red-hot metal through ice. He squinted. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Del Rey revealed a small void, not fear, but a lapse, a misstep from someone who always controlled, and in this room, where every word carried the weight of collapse, that was a dangerous crack. A young lawyer seated below, previously stripped of his license by Del Rey for daring to request a review of 2 unrepresented cases in the year 2020, leaned forward to jot something on the edge of his paper, not to argue, but to record precisely each beat of decline manifesting across from him. In the press row, a veteran reporter who once worked for the network that shielded Del Rey lowered his camera, removed his press badge, and slipped it into his pocket. He knew this moment was not for those in the middle. It was the downward slope for those who had backed the wrong person. Outside the courtroom, an auxiliary screen broadcasting live was captured by someone at the exact moment Del Rey smirked, then immediately turned into a meme with the caption, "Not a court, thanks for admitting it." The image spread rapidly. A group of law students printed it and hung it at the entrance to their university's legal research center with the subheading, "Self-performing is a right, but being recorded is justice." A retired judge, once nominated by Del Rey to the State Legal Oversight Council, was seen retracting all academic articles citing Del Rey. The reason? Handwritten and sent to the editorial board. "I don't write to defend a performance. I write to serve the truth, and I've been deceived for too long." The letter was published verbatim, unedited, on the front page of a leading legal journal, accompanied by the caption, "The Rain Effect, when truth needs no script." Crowds began gathering outside the courthouse, not to protest, but to observe. They carried no banners, no loudspeakers. They wore headphones plugged directly into the live broadcast of the trial. A group of high school students sat on the stone steps, faces glued to phone screens, ears tuned to the same channel, mouths murmuring each of Rain's words. One turned to a friend, repeating what they had just learned. She doesn't need to raise her voice, because truth echoes when no one blocks it. Inside, Rain remained, unblinking. Her hand still rested on the file, now turned to the first page. The bolded title read, Systemic Interference, Analysis of 38 Cases under Coordination Code DC-04-ON. She looked up, waiting for no one's nod. We continue. Rain did not wait for a nod. Section 38, Contend, List of Interfered Cases. The screen lit up with a detailed Excel sheet, each line marked in red. Defendant names, case numbers, trial dates, and on the right, a note column. Request from D. No one needed clarification on who D was. In this room, everyone understood. Del Rey sat upright, his hands beginning to clench into fists on the table. But he did not speak. No more sarcasm, no more smirks. Rain had stripped him of the last thing a powerful man possesses, denial. A senior FBI agent, who had served directly under Del Rey for 2 terms, bowed his head to look at the list, then closed his notebook. On the table before him, his badge had been removed from his wallet, face down, like an unspoken resignation. Across the room, a data technician, responsible for encrypting the internal system, trembled so much he dropped his pen, picking it up on the second attempt to continue writing. On social media, the Excel sheet was captured from the live broadcast and spread like a blade slicing through the credibility of the entire state judiciary. Each red cell numbered, tagged with Request from D, and the names of those once inexplicably acquitted. There are at least 16 cases, according to preliminary investigation, that were redirected. 2 of them resulted in executions. Rain turned to look directly at the presiding judge, without adding a single word. The court may order separate criminal investigations for each file. Beneath the prosecution bench, a middle-aged woman, a relative of someone executed in that list, sobbed silently. She clutched her hand to her chest, as if fearing her heart would burst. A photo capturing that moment was taken by a reporter, unedited, and became the cover image on the front pages of 3 major newspapers on the same day. Del Rey turned to his lawyer, a graying man with a lifeless expression. Rain knew he had anticipated this, but what he hadn't foreseen was the speed. The way each piece was revealed was not in order, not following logic, but in a sequence of fragmentation, a spinal fracture without force, just precision. Outside, the group of law students once denied internships by Del Rey gathered before the court, not carrying signs but real files of previously concealed cases. They sat in rows, each reading aloud a line from the verdicts, not to accuse but to complete the parts the previous trial never fully read. Meanwhile, a television director who had planned a documentary on Del Rey publicly canceled the project, explaining, "We don't want to turn victims into supporting actors." A wave of celebrities shared this decision as a cultural commitment that a dark chapter should not be recreated with special effects. Inside the courtroom, a federal policy advisor sent a message retracting Del Rey's invitation to a national legal reform seminar with a brief note: "This name no longer represents anything worth learning." An independent Justice Institute researcher wrote an open letter to all legal scholars. From now on, all materials sourced from the system under D should carry an academic warning label. Like those once used for pesticides, the entire field no longer viewed Del Rey as a fallen figure but as a systemic flaw, once disguised by position. Meanwhile, his expression, though still seemingly composed, showed cracks. The television camera captured the moment Del Rey swallowed hard, then lightly clenched both hands on the table, as if grasping something no longer real. And in the center of that fluorescent-lit room, Rain remained steadfast, head unbowed, repeating none of her previous words. Because, in the prosecution of what was once deemed unprovable, the silence of the one who gave orders became the heaviest evidence. Final section. Rain nodded slightly. The screen dimmed for a few seconds, then displayed a shaky frame. This wasn't surveillance footage. It was a phone video, likely from inside a car. In it, Del Rey, out of uniform, sat in the back seat. A voice spoke. "That female agent? Rain, I'll give her 36 more hours. After that, it's either me or her." No one in the room spoke. The presiding judge, jury, reporters, observers, and even security personnel, all silent. Not far away, an IT staff member in the courtroom, who had monitored all data since the case began, suddenly stood up, left his seat, and quickly exited through the back door. No one stopped him. His face was pale, as if he had just heard his own name embedded in that sentence. Outside the courtroom, the live stream reached a record high across the state's legal system. Over 4 million views within 10 minutes, and the phrase, "either me or her," topped national search trend. The visual artist immediately turned that moment into a black and white poster. Del Rey, in the back seat, with blood-red text overlay, chose to be the villain. Del Rey lunged forward, nearly toppling the table. "That doesn't prove anything. No one can prove who recorded it." Fabricated evidence, improper collection, violation of privacy. Behind him, 3 federal security officers placed their hands on their belts, not to threaten but to ensure that if he acted out, the suppression protocol wouldn't be handled by his lawyer. One of them, who had once saluted Del Rey with respect, this time did not look at him, eyes fixed on Rain as if awaiting a signal. "That statement," Rain interrupted, her voice sharp like a whistle in a Cold War, "was recorded using a device in a rental car owned by a company affiliated with the Internal Affairs Office, and by law, data stored by a third party does not require consent to be admissible in court." He froze. A camera shutter clicked from the press row, capturing the exact moment Del Rey's face went blank. The photo was instantly disseminated, with many news outlets inserting it into headlines. Del Rey finally silenced. Online, comments added memes, his sweating face, hands suspended mid-air, captioned, "When the director forgets the script and the camera is still rolling." For the first time, Del Rey had nothing to say. He sat down, or rather collapsed, as if the true weight of everything he had ever said, done, and concealed over 30 years had just crashed onto his own chest. The entire room remained still. A political advisor whispered over the phone to an assistant, "Cancel all post-trial campaigns. That name holds no defensive value." In a nearby cafe where the live stream played on a large screen, all patrons simultaneously stood and applauded without prompting. Rain did not look away. She did not smirk, did not show pride, only a gaze like a blade still sheathed, but ready to cut the moment it had to. And in that moment, beneath the sterile chill of fluorescent light, no one saw a witness or an agent anymore. They saw the purest form of justice, without emotion, without mercy, without the need to scream. Only the truth, and a hand steady enough not to tremble when holding it. The late-season wind no longer blew against her back, like a reminder to keep moving. Rain stood outside the federal courthouse, where she had just pulled out fragments of brutal memories and turned them into evidence. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply stood there, watching people pass in and out, as if trying to hear the echo of her own footsteps from the past, the years when she had been dragged through the mud by the very system she had once risked her life to defend. The press jostled, flashes fired relentlessly. A man in a silver-gray suit, representing the Attorney General, stepped up to the podium and read her name with the solemnity of a reversed indictment. Agent Rain Whitmore. For courage, for unwavering resolve, and for a spirit of service beyond personal recognition. The federal government honors you before the entire nation. Applause broke like waves. A ribbon was prepared, a red carpet laid, and cameras locked into position. But Rain did not step up. "I don't need to stand above," she said, her voice neither shaky nor stiff. It was simply true, like everything she had ever said. "I just need them, those who were once broken in silence, not to be buried in the mud the way I once was." The entire plaza paused for a beat, not because of her words, but because of the way she stood there, upright, eyes not seeking lights nor avoiding anyone's gaze. In a long moment, no reporter dared break in with a mic. No politician stepped up to reshape her words into something more palatable, because everyone knew no one can revise a truth already spoken, at the exact weight it deserved. But across the street, in the crowd, a group of students stretched out a large banner. "Honor doesn't patch the holes in justice." Below it, they posted black and white printouts of the rulings Rain had overturned, each one marked with a red-streaked line. "No one here asked for medals. They wanted to survive." The photo of that banner went viral in under 3 hours, replacing the entire planned layout of a major magazine's coverage of the honors ceremony. After Rain's refusal, a veteran reporter looked up from his recorder and quietly tore up the slip of paper titled "Heroine Steps into the Light" that his editors had prepared. He folded it into his pocket and replaced it with a new, handwritten line. His hand shaky, but his script firm, the only woman who understood that glory was once built from other people's pain. That quote became the official lead-in for the national evening broadcast and triggered more than 500 emails to the newsroom, demanding that Rain's full speech be shared unedited. In another corner of the plaza, where an LED screen displayed photos of a younger Rain, a group of former victims stood holding placards bearing the names of those convicted under Del Rey's tenure. They did not shout, did not push forward. They simply held high the names of sons, husbands, sisters, or themselves. When the camera panned, an elderly man who had spent 11 months in prison for a charge nullified just 3 weeks earlier stepped forward and said clearly, "If you want to honor someone, start by making sure we never have to speak again." That statement did not appear in the official news broadcast, but it was recorded by bystanders, trimmed into a 17-second clip, hashtagged "No Need for Statues," and spread like a silent declaration. Within 24 hours, the clip appeared across nearly every major social media platform, amassing hundreds of thousands of comments in agreement, including from retired judges who had once worked alongside Del Rey and were now publicly apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Most notable was a small press conference held by a group of independent lawyers, those once suspended from the bar 3 years ago for undermining the image of the justice system after accusing Del Rey of tampering with court records. Now reinstated, they returned with a quiet power. During the conference, one female attorney pulled out an old file signed by Del Rey, tapped the cover gently, and said into the camera, "The day he signed this judgment, I filed a complaint. No one read it. Today, I don't need him to answer. I need the public to never forget what that signature once stood for." Behind her, a slide displayed Del Rey's faded but still recognizable ink stamp. Beneath it, the words, "Once power, now a lesson." By the next morning, every tribute to Del Rey in the Judicial Archive had been moved into a pending review folder. Law schools temporarily suspended the use of his authored materials. A National Legal Reform Council released a list of structures that have decayed, with Del Rey's name at the top. No footnote required. Those who once called him a mentor now avoided cameras, and those who had once stayed silent now stood in the middle of the square, nodding at Rain, as if returning a fragment of dignity they had lost when choosing the safer side. A federal communications director turned to his assistant, puzzled. "What now?" he asked. The assistant responded with a shrug, the kind that signifies an understanding that some things cannot be spun. At that moment, the director's phone vibrated incessantly with messages from the emergency advisory group, all repeating the same line: "Do not interfere. Do not turn this into a brand." Each word served as a cold affirmation that Rain was not a symbol for the system to brandish. She was the silent verdict no one dared to reassess. A petite, brown-skinned woman stood at the spectator barrier, her trembling hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy beside her. "That's her," she whispered. "She used to live at the Eastern Relief Station. She's the one who saved my son when our house burned down." The words, carried by the wind, spread like an electric current. The boy looked up at Rain, eyes fixed, then suddenly raised his hand in a wave, not as one would to a celebrity, but as one would to someone who had once carried him through fire. Behind them, another woman lifted her phone to record, not focusing on Rain, but on the security personnel and politicians lurking backstage, some stepping out of frame, others quietly retreating. No one wanted to be recorded on the wrong side of history again. In the back rows, a homeless man who had been wrongfully prosecuted in a case orchestrated by Del Rey clasped his hands before his chest, eyes brimming with tears. He didn't fully grasp the law, but he knew that on this day, someone stood firm, ensuring that hundreds of others would no longer be trampled upon. As he looked toward the honorary seats, once occupied by prominent figures in the justice system, his gaze halted. The seats were empty. No one dared to sit there today. A young woman approached and placed a small sign made from recycled cardboard on one of the chairs. Scrawled in red ink, "This seat is reserved for the void of ethics." The press began to step back, not because they were obstructed, but because none wished to intrude upon the solemn space surrounding her. A cameraman set down his equipment to wipe his lens, not due to dust, but because his hands were shaking. He had once followed Del Rey for 4 years during press conferences and had listed Rain as a potentially biased source. But today, seeing her stand there, without slogans, he realized that some images should not be edited. Behind him, a television editor removed his headset and spoke into his walkie-talkie. No background music, no editing into a clip. This scene must remain untouched. The atmosphere was not one of victory. It was the sediment of countless instances where people had looked away and were now compelled to see. A group of high school students, invited as part of the Next Generation Justice Education program, stood in formation, each holding a black and white copy of a request for a public defender they had collected from homeless families around the city. Each form had a line underlined, "Denied, no reason given." One student turned to the television camera and softly said, without a microphone, "If they don't have lawyers, then today we will be their listeners." At the edge of the stage area, a street artist had just completed a charcoal sketch of Rain, but there were no facial features, just the silhouette of a woman standing against a white sky, with hundreds of paper fragments rising behind her like ashes. Beneath the drawing he wrote, "When someone needs no business card, yet changes the entire system, that is justice." An officer whom Rain had trained in her early days approached and handed her a small velvet-wrapped item. "Your old badge, found it in the evidence locker in the basement." They didn't put a name on it, just a code. Rain took it without opening it. She held it tightly, then placed it into her coat pocket. It wasn't a symbol. It was a fragment of memory she had never sought to reclaim, but now had found. No one recorded that moment. No one turned it into a clip, because it required no effects, only silent witnesses. But after the ceremony, within the internal justice system database, the code on that badge was restored to its full name, Rain Whitmore. And in the accompanying note, there was only one line, "Never anonymous again." In a brief press conference afterward, when asked why she declined the honor, Rain simply said, "I once lived in a windowless room. My documents were confiscated. My identity erased. I used to think I was invisible. Honors don't return that time. But I hope that from now on, no other child will ever have to wonder if they truly exist." Her response lasted less than 20 seconds. But in the press room, no one posed another question. A television host attempted to raise a media-frazzled question, but Rain's calm, unguarded gaze led him to lower his microphone and whispered to a colleague, "If I ask more, I'm no different from those who once erased her name from the records." A renowned political commentator wrote on his personal page, "She is not a symbol. Symbols can be forgotten. She is a milestone, and no one passes a milestone without looking back." That statement became the slogan printed on the backs of shirts worn by a group of law students during a peaceful march around Del Rey's former headquarters. They chanted no slogans, carried no banners. They walked in unison, each holding a small wooden plaque engraved with the words, "Justice needs no headquarters. It needs memory." The image of that silent procession was published in an international newspaper, prompting documentary producers who had considered acquiring the rights to Rain's story to withdraw their proposals after facing a wave of public opposition. People did not want her story to be repackaged for consumption. Meanwhile, Del Rey remained detained at a temporary security facility. He requested to see a lawyer 3 times in one afternoon. All requests were denied under special procedures for suspects of severe power abuse. There were no press releases. No one stepped forward to defend him on behalf of the system. A detention officer who had once served under Rain was assigned to document Del Rey's contact record. On the first form, instead of writing "defendant requests to see a lawyer," she wrote boldly, "Those who once denied others the right to counsel shall not automatically enjoy this privilege." News about him was relegated to the side columns of legal bulletins, like relics of a bygone era. In the brief news, no highlights section of a newspaper once sponsored by Del Rey for content throughout 2 terms, his name appeared between 2 short pieces about a bread theft and a sewage leak incident. No subheadings, no mention of renowned former judge, simply Carlo D.W., currently detained under Clause 12.34. Those who had once shared the stage with him at legal conferences erased all related images. A prestigious university quietly removed his doctoral thesis from its digital library due to excessive citations of administrative principles no longer aligned with reformist ideals. A television producer proposed a documentary about the case, but the community responded with fierce opposition. A wave of hashtags, "Do not recreate the pain," spread in just 12 hours after the project was leaked. A well-known actress who had been cast as Rain in an early draft of the script spoke out publicly, "If I take that role, I become an extension of injustice. Not because of acting, but because I would be allowing the audience to digest truth as something called entertainment." Within a single day, the entire production lost funding. The script was scrapped. The studio issued a written apology, and the community, instead of celebrating, left only a cold comment beneath the announcement. "This is not a movie, this is a wound, and it's still bleeding." Rain left the federal compound at the end of the day. No escorts, no photos. She walked alone past the bus station, past the community health clinic, where she had once stitched a wound on her own stomach to avoid being processed into the hospital system. A nurse recognized her and called her name. She simply smiled and shook her head. "No thanks needed. I still owe this city a better life for those who never had a place." What seemed like a quiet farewell was overheard and recorded by a nearby medical student. Within 24 hours, that line appeared across electronic bulletin boards at clinics in low-income neighborhoods, replacing long-faded slogans about serving the people. No one knew where she would go next, but 2 days later, in a small suburban community group in the South, someone posted a blurry photo of a woman pulling electrical wires late at night in a room still unlit, captioned, "Some people don't need to know your name to fix your socket like you're part of something bigger." The photo had no tags, but it spread like a slow burn detonation. Person by person, those who had once seen her, once been helped by her, began sharing their own fragments of memory. A homeless man, once summarily acquitted under Del Rey, wrote, "I used to think she was with the electric company. Now I know she's been rewiring the current for a whole generation whose dignity got blacked out." A month later, in a poor southern neighborhood, a free legal aid center opened its doors. There was no ribbon cutting, no background music, no speeches from local officials, because when they offered, the community pushed back. They didn't want opening remarks from those who had never listened. Instead, the neighborhood children, dragged over plastic chairs, sat in a circle around the window and read aloud the lines from past legal aid applications that had been denied. One line, one voice, each word a bell. No one cried, but those who had signed off on the denials sat watching the live stream. None dared comment. Rain's name wasn't on the co-founder plaque, but the old security guard at the center said, "A woman came in to install the light bulbs for the new office. She knew how to wire the ceiling without asking." Before she left, she dropped off a file with notes on every case at risk of judicial abuse, and one line handwritten on the cover, "Don't make them scream just to be heard." A law student later discovered the notes contained internal classification codes that only someone who had worked within the Federal Investigative Division could decode. These were records no one should have had access to, and now they were in the community's hand, not for revenge, but for protection, in the exact way the system once refused to provide. Meanwhile, Del Rey's name vanished from the official search directory of a major legal education platform, the one he had once funded to teach law through real-world scenarios. A leaked internal email revealed that the executive board had unanimously agreed to delete all instructional content involving Del Rey to avoid perpetuating outdated, offensive, and covertly rights-violating legal standards. Those who had once bragged of studying under him now stayed silent, deleted posts, or shifted their positions. A professor he had once sponsored was protested at an academic conference for refusing to retract an article calling Del Rey the architect of judicial reform. When students walked out mid-speech, the last one in line said a single sentence without looking back. "We don't learn from someone who dressed up wrongdoing in a teacher's coat." In one small corner of the new center, a female staff member hand-wrote a sign on a wooden board hanging at the entrance. "Here, justice has no VIP seats. It sits on the floor with you." The line was photographed and became the background on dozens of phones belonging to young lawyers, students, and social activists. No one mentioned Rain's name during the center's opening. No one needed to, because they understood. If you must name someone to prove they did the right thing, then the system has not yet learned how to remember through action. And that was enough for those who once had no home to no longer be homeless, not because they now had a bed, but because someone had acknowledged they exist through action, without needing to stand above. On the roof of that legal aid center, an old solar panel, freshly cleaned of years of dust, reflected the afternoon sun like a silent declaration. No signage, no advertisements. Here, everything was clear enough for those who had lived in darkness. And on an early summer afternoon, amidst a city still filled with dead ends, a young girl, about 16 years old, stepped through the glass doors of the center with matted curly hair, worn-out sneakers, and eyes that no longer believed in miracles. No one turned to look, but no one was indifferent. There was something in her gait, tense and cautious, as if stepping into a place that had once denied her existence, that made the entire space hold its breath. Her name was Alea. No one asked for her last name. No one asked for reasons. Only a middle-aged woman, the intake staff, looked at the file, then looked up and asked a single question. "Have you ever been denied the right to an attorney?" Alea nodded, and with that she was admitted. On the table, the pen trembled slightly in her hand, not out of fear, but because it was the first time someone had asked her a question short enough to answer without having to disclose her entire past like a suspect. The first pages of her file were turned as if there had never been barriers. No moral checks, no requirements to prove eligibility. Here, there was only one condition, having been turned away by the system. But as she pulled out a crumpled stack of papers, including old letters, fines, hospital notes, and a copy of a summons, a young lawyer, who had just entered, suddenly froze. He looked closely at the final signature on the indictment, a name that had once been displayed in gold letters above the city courthouse. Del Rey W. Carlo. No further words were needed. A glance was exchanged among the legal staff in the room, as if the entire center had just heard the crack of a fissure they thought had closed. Each of Alea's notes was cross-referenced with the list of cases Rain had previously investigated, and strangely, in a small section they found an unusual verdict. Prosecution without a lawyer, without a guardian, only a single report signed by Judge Del Rey. That verdict, the date issued was Alea's 13th birthday. The statement was just over 3 lines. The offense, public disturbance because she slept on a bench in East Park. A charge with no photos, no witnesses, no counter records, only the round seal stamped over the signature of someone who had once been a symbol of power. The atmosphere in the room was no longer quiet. An elderly lawyer who had been suspended by Delea for court misconduct sat up straight, placed his hand on the file, and said slowly, "This is not a mistake. "This is evidence of a model." The others did not object. A younger, usually reserved lawyer quietly pulled a chair next to Alea. In his hand was a new file, an investigative report on juvenile trials without attorneys during the period from 2017 to 2021. He opened the first page, looked at the data line, 84 cases, and at the bottom of the page, 69 signatures, all Del Rey. At that moment, a silver-haired woman, the center's coordinator, stopped forward, placing a legal consent form in front of Alea, but this time, the signer was her, no one else. A thin sheet of paper, but the sound of the pen gliding across it was like the echo of a verdict against the tide of history. The air thickened as the final line was completed. Someone pulled out a phone, taking a photo from behind her shoulder, where the line prosecuted on June 8th was placed next to the new line. Investigation begins on June 8th. 2 notes, 3 years apart, but intersecting right on the desk. In the hallway, a group of law students had received the information. One of them quietly posted on the public bulletin board a map showing the distribution of prosecutions without attorneys. The red zone, exactly where Alea had lived. No one ordered it, no one stopped it, but the eyes of passers-by lingered long enough to understand. What had just been exposed was no longer an incident, but a structure, and at the center of that structure was a signature once deemed untouchable. And just as that data board's ink hadn't dried, Alea's file was already labeled red in the internal system. Requires independent assessment, a procedure that Del Rey himself had removed from the process 3 years prior. Now it returned, but not through a ruling, through the actions of those once considered marginal. The staff member fell silent, then picked up the phone to make an internal call, and in less than 15 minutes, a legal team from the Civil Justice Reform Organization appeared. Each person carried investigative boards, file scanners, and coding notebooks. A small campaign began, quiet but swift, and Alea, the homeless girl once only touched by pity, now became the starting point for a new federal investigation, filed using Del Rey's tenure. The surrounding lawyers didn't read the file with their eyes. They skimmed through each detail as if flipping through their own memories, because many of them had been blocked from advancement by Del Rey or suspended for insubordination. One among them, a black female lawyer who had lost her license for questioning the legality of in absentia trials, held up a copy of her old disciplinary decision, then smirked. "This is a late apology, but at least this time it comes with evidence." News began to spread. On independent media channels, small articles appeared. Local court once dismissed 38 cases in a year. No one knew why. The list of homeless individuals prosecuted for minor offenses without legal protection is growing, coinciding with the tenure of a single individual. The rain effect, when justice no longer sits in the courtroom but steps out of it. Simultaneously, a lawyer forum publicly shared a decoded data link. Hundreds of verdicts with Del Rey's signature highlighted in red, each attached to the real names of defendants. Names once referred to by file numbers, now placed where they always belonged, at the top. A local graffiti artist recreated that list on the wall behind a subway station, using reflective paint. By day, only faint squares were visible, but when night fell, the letters emerged. No one is forgotten, unless the powerful wish it so. On social media, the hashtag Justice from the Ground Up was shared over 2 million times within 48 hours. A clip excerpted from an internal meeting of the Judicial Disciplinary Council also leaked. In it, a senior judge admitted, voice trembling, "We once thought he was just strict, but now I believe we were silent before a profiteering structure." With just a 13-second snippet, thousands of comments poured in. One comment was pinned at the top: "If he was the structure, then we were the foundation that remained silent." An international human rights organization, Equal Access, announced that it would open a branch office right in the neighborhood where Rain once lived. They did not launch it with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, but with a community conversation where everyone had the right to share their story without being interrupted. Under the warm yellow lights of an old laundromat converted into a meeting room, more than 30 people stood up, one by one, from a former inmate who had been jailed for 6 months for the charge of gathering after 10 p.m., to a single mother who had lost custody of her child for not having legal representation. A man quietly brought in an old wooden table, placed a stack of documents and a small speaker on it. He made no speech. He just pressed play. A voice echoed, reading directly from court transcripts during Del Rey's era, detailing how he had been denied the right to appeal for having inadequate courtroom demeanor. And in that gathering, Alea stood up. She gave no speech. She simply recounted the night she was arrested for sleeping under the eaves of City Hall, and how the officer shoved her into the car without even asking her name. No one interrupted, no one interjected. But when she described the feeling of being labeled a public nuisance for simply surviving, the whole room fell still. A woman in the front row began to cry, covering her face. She had once been a nurse. Her daughter died after being wrongfully charged, denied access to legal aid. The woman looked at Alea, not with pity, but with apology, as if Alea's story had unlocked the door for dozens of others to rise at once. A short video clip of her testimony spread rapidly. Major news stations reported, from silence to witness, from being prosecuted to being heard. The girl knows no law, but knows she was betrayed by something called justice. Local judges were summoned. The State Inspector General's office demanded a full audit of all verdicts from the past 3 years. No longer recommendations, no longer review suggested, but a comprehensive investigation with direct federal oversight. A court clerk who once served under Del Rey stood before cameras in a brief interview, her hands trembling as she held audio recordings of internal meetings she had secretly kept. "I knew if I spoke up earlier I'd lose my job, but now, if I stay silent, I won't be able to live with myself." That line was turned into an image and circulated as fast as the most viral political hashtags. One social media user commented, "Justice doesn't arrive late. Fear just got there first." Some officials rushed to submit resignations. Others cited health concerns, filed psychological reports, and tried to stretch out their silence a little longer. But the system no longer wanted to cover its ears. A petition with 150,000 signatures was filed in the morning, and by that afternoon, Del Rey's name was removed from the state court website. No announcement, no explanation, just a blank space where a 3-paragraph biography used to be. One social media user screenshotted the moment and captioned, "Justice doesn't need to scream. Sometimes it just presses delete." A local radio station replayed an old news clip in which Del Rey had once mocked the legal congestion caused by poor people. Now, that very speech was remixed as background for a TikTok video where each witness, each wrongfully convicted person, each suspended attorney appeared one after another, holding signs that read, "I'm the one you called a burden." Within a single night, the video reached 2 million views. The online community no longer saw Del Rey as an individual, but as a structure once armored in power, and now peeled apart layer by layer. Through evidence, through voices, through every lie once met with applause, the system began to turn on itself. A legal department director, once Del Rey's close advisor, was caught on video being heckled by a crowd in the courthouse lobby. He fled through the back entrance, but before he disappeared, someone slapped a white paper with bold red letters onto his car window. "This is not a manhunt. This is memory collection." The image went viral across political forums with the caption, "History doesn't need knives to cut. It only needs to look back." But the public was no longer silent. They no longer needed someone to speak on their behalf. Those who had only been spectators were now rewriting the rules of the game. A third-year law student who initiated the campaign "Reopen Old Cases" appeared on national television. No microphone, no applause cues, just one cold sentence. "I don't want revenge. I just want to bring light back to where the bulbs were screwed in to stay off." And the entire studio stood up. They had learned the most important lesson from Rain. The sun does not need an introduction. It only needs to appear, and the darkness will retreat. Rain received the first bulletin from Equal Access, did not reply. She simply sent a handwritten card with a single, steady line. "As long as they get to walk through the door without bowing their heads, that is enough." A well-known social commentator, once famous for his biting satire, wrote on his personal blog, "I used to think justice needed symbols, but no, it needs witnesses." And Rain was a witness who needed no oath, because everything she spoke, she had already lived. At the small train station on the southern edge of the city, Alea sat beside an elderly man with silver hair, flipping through a newspaper. He looked at her, nodded, and said, "You're a lot like Miss Rain. You don't need a loud voice, you just need not to shy away from the light." She smiled faintly, and for the first time, with the sound of a train whistle echoing in the distance, she didn't feel like she had to run from anything. But while she let her shoulders relax into a rhythm of life slowly stabilizing, elsewhere, in the very buildings Del Rey once signed off to govern, signs of resistance began to emerge in ways no one could have predicted. On the campus of a law school, students hung black, human-shaped boards outside the auditorium. Each cutout bore a quote from a verdict once signed by Del Rey. "No lawyer needed. The court is transparent enough. Detained to prevent a relapse into poverty. Second-class citizens have no right to dispute." These words, once legalized through a pen stroke, had now become collective hauntings, suspended in air like ghosts, exposing their maker. And then, like all domino reactions, the long-forgotten verdicts began to be reopened, not by media campaigns, but by actual petitions, actual witnesses, and a list of people buried by the system, people who had never once heard their names pronounced correctly in court. A group of parents in a neighboring state organized a gathering, not to protest, but to simultaneously file formal complaints against the lack of juvenile legal protection during Del Rey's tenure. They hired a professional production team to film the session, live streaming every minute, every testimony, every neglected medical and school record. When a video of a mother reading aloud the absurd indictment against her daughter, jailed for 3 days for staring at a police officer, was shared on a public forum, the comment section ignited like wildfire. He wasn't wrong because the system never told him he was. But we're not silent anymore. Rain's story no longer sat in the archives of triumph. It had become a current, flowing into the system, into the very people who once believed they were invisible. A young actress who had remained silent when asked to play Rain in a propagandistic play for the Justice Department the year before, now stepped onto a real stage, stood in front of City Hall, and recited the monologue she had once been forced to revise. "I don't need to be thanked. I need to be believed. And if I'm no longer here, someone else will still speak the truth." The clip was only 1 minute long, but the words once cut from the script, now read out, word for word, breath for breath, echoed hundreds of times in the chests of those standing below. Because not everyone can change the law, but anyone can prove they are worthy of having it applied fairly. An independent data center, formerly a partner of Del Rey during his time in office, was hacked, and part of their archive was unexpectedly decrypted. A string of internal emails titled "Filter Cases" by low complaint potential. Among them, over 300 verdicts were marked with the code LOQ, low outcry quotient. Journalists didn't need to add emphasis. Those very codes exposed, by themselves, the intent of an entire system that once decided who deserved to be heard and who should be buried silently. And so, another flame was lit. Not loud, not craving recognition. It simply needed light, like the sun that shows up every day without needing an introduction. That light today shone directly into Del Rey's final sentencing hearing. The federal courtroom was packed. The jury seats were fully occupied. The hallway was tightly secured. Television stations had set up crane cameras outside, each angle planned as if filming a national ceremony. But inside, There were no flowers, no music, only an atmosphere compressed to the point of suffocation, because today, the name that had silenced many would be read aloud, not as a symbol of power, but as a defendant guilty of crimes against the very justice system he once represented. Del Rey entered the courtroom with an unyielding expression. He wore a lead-gray suit. His wrists were handcuffed but concealed beneath his coat sleeves. He turned his head to look around, one last time, as if stepping onto a stage. But this time, there were no spotlights, only the eyes of dozens he had forgotten, scorned, and crushed. And those eyes did not scream, did not curse, simply waited. For justice, when timely, needs no haste. A young court clerk handed him a pen to sign the acknowledgement form, but as he touched it, the clerk pulled back, wiping the pen's tip with a disinfectant cloth as if it had touched the filthiest thing in the room. He smirked, about to make a mocking remark, but the contemptuous gaze of the young man, along with a whispered phrase that reached his ear, "You used to laugh when people fell apart. Now it's your turn, and no one can even muster a laugh for you," wiped the smirk off his face. The atmosphere grew colder as he passed the public seating. An elderly woman, once a victim, tried without legal representation during his tenure, stood up, removed her scarf and threw it onto the floor where his steps would fall. No one picked it up. No one reacted. But her gaze, sharp as a blade honed by endurance, made Del Rey, though accustomed to intense interrogations, suddenly feel the weight on his shoulders. Behind, a child around 12 tugged at his father's hand, pointing at him and loudly asked, as if unintentionally, "Dad, why does that man get to dress nicely when he did bad things?" No one answered, but the question spread through the room like a cut, tearing apart the last facade he tried to maintain. The escorting officer walked slowly, not out of ceremony, but because at the courtroom door, a middle-aged man, in an old office uniform with a faded name tag, stood blocking the way. He was a court records clerk, once reassigned for daring to expose Del Rey's judicial misconduct years ago. No one had announced his presence, no one prompted him to speak, but he pulled from his pocket a frayed photocopy, a copy of the decision that forced him into unpaid leave for non-cooperation with superiors. He held the paper up to Del Rey's eye level, said nothing, then firmly tucked it into Del Rey's coat pocket. The action wasn't aggressive, but heavy enough for Del Rey to understand. His past would be returned, piece by piece, just as he had torn others apart, not quickly, but inevitably. Once everyone was seated, the elderly judge spoke in a steady, deep voice, not triumphant, not vengeful, just the truth, spoken before the people. "Defendant, Del Rey W. Carlo," he said, his voice echoing through the microphone like a slow bell toll. "The court sentences you to 17 years in prison, without parole, for the crimes of judicial abuse of power, deprivation of legal protection rights, evidence manipulation, and federal witness intimidation." Del Rey blinked slowly, trying to remain composed, but his shoulders trembled slightly, barely noticeable, only those nearby could see, as if an old beast unaccustomed to others placing a hand on its neck. From the right corner of the courtroom, a faint hiss sounded, unclear from whom, but it didn't fade. It spread like an aftershock. Some bowed their heads, some shed tears, but most remained silent, not out of a lack of emotion, but because they knew no words could encapsulate what had been lost. 17 years was the sentence, but the truth was Del Rey's name would no longer be accompanied by any title. He raised his head, trying to keep his back straight. He looked around, eyes scanning each face as if seeking a sympathetic glance, or at least a hint of doubt, but there was none. Only Rain, standing at the back, not in uniform, no badge. She just stood there, slender but unyielding. Her eyes bore no vengeance. They seemed to remind him, do not laugh at others' pain if you are the one who caused it. And when that gaze locked onto the last look he tried to salvage in this room, a dry, short, cold laugh erupted from the press row. Like the click of a gun's safety. The reporter didn't hide her camera. She stared at him intently, then wrote on a note sent directly to the editor, "He doesn't look like someone with power. He looks like the last shadow of himself." Del Rey exited the courtroom, hands still cuffed, flanked by 2 judicial officers. The crowd didn't cheer, nor did they throw anything. They simply parted like a tide, making way for the conclusion to proceed in order. But that silence was no longer passive. It was collective denial. Some raised phones to record, but didn't live stream. They just captured a moment many had wished for, the day his suit no longer represented power, but the funeral of arrogance. A young candy vendor stood by the security fence, handed a candy bar to an officer, and whispered, "Please make sure he doesn't escape. My mom said he used to chase us out of the park." The officer didn't respond, just nodded slightly and tightened the cuffs by half a notch. Del Rey hissed through his teeth, not from pain, but from understanding. Every word from the outside now carried more weight than the courtroom's verdict. A small midday breeze lifted his coat hem, revealing a belt replaced with a nylon drawstring, a small but bitter detail, as if the entire system was peeling away the remaining illusions from his body. As he stepped onto the first stair, a middle-aged man approached, pressed a crumpled paper against his chest, then quickly withdrew his hand as if avoiding filth. It was the man's own commutation request from 8 years ago, once dismissed by Del Rey within 5 minutes without reading the file. Below the request was a handwritten note, in red ink. "Today, I ask for nothing. I just want you to know. I still remember." The police moved to push the man away, but the crowd simultaneously stepped back, making room, as if truth itself needed a moment on stage. When Del Rey reached the second stair, an elderly black woman leaning on a cane stepped out from the line. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She simply took from her pocket an old photograph, wrapped in plastic, and held it up to his eye level. In the photo, a young woman sat crying in front of the courthouse, clutching a baby. He tried to turn away, but she growled, "My daughter died in prison because of your unjust ruling. My grandchild no longer speaks." Every day he looks at this photo. The picture fell at his feet, sliding down the stone steps like a silent verdict, needing no words. But just as he stepped onto the third step of the courthouse, something unexpected happened. A homeless man, wearing an old knit cap, holding an empty Starbucks paper cup, stood in his way. He was about to shout for him to move, but the man's gaze made him freeze. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. That face, Del Rey had seen it, no fewer than 3 times in hearings of forgotten cases. As a witness whose testimony was dismissed, as a man who had been thrown out of the courtroom for having no legal value, as someone Del Rey himself once told the guard, "Get this guy out of here. His poverty stinks up the air." And now that same man said nothing. He just looked at Del Rey as if observing a living piece of evidence. Then, from the pocket of his tattered coat, he pulled out a small item, a badge. The silver metal surface was scratched, but 3 letters still gleamed clearly. FBI. No one understood. No one was given an explanation. But that moment, like a final blow, brought Del Rey to his knees. He turned away, but could not hide his expression, not from fear, but from knowing. The very system he had once manipulated was now returning from the place he thought was the bottom. The crowd at first remained silent, but as he turned his back, a young man stepped out from behind the security barrier, raising a sign with messy but razor-sharp handwriting. "I once sat in prison because of your ruling. Now I stand here because I survived." Those words, simple, needing no elaboration, struck Del Rey in the chest like an invisible punch, heavier than any pair of handcuffs. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, the sound of a portable printer came to life. A group of law students had set up a temporary table, continuously printing old court rulings signed by Del Rey. Each page laminated, strung along a line that stretched across the plaza like laundry. Each verdict was a new indictment, no trial required. As he walked past, the wind lifted the sheets, slapping him in the face. A little girl, around 10 years old, approached and handed him a packet of tissues. "For the pain you never wiped from anyone else," she said. No one laughed. No one stopped her. She turned and walked away, letting the packet fall at his feet. He didn't bend to pick it up, nor did he dare to kick it aside. It lay there, a bitter reminder. In his days of power, he once ordered her mother handcuffed, simply for parking 3 minutes too long at a curb. And now, that same girl stood tall before him, a living verdict, written not by law, but by memory. He tried to slip away from the spotlight, but the cameras on the 3rd floor of the building caught every angle. One lens zoomed tight on his pale face, another panned slowly from behind, capturing a back that once stood straight like a flagpole of power, now hunched like a man whose spine had snapped. In less than 2 hours, the photo of the homeless man raising his badge toward Delray had been shared over 3 million times. But what went even more viral was the slow-motion video of that moment, a right-angle shot where sunlight pierced through the city's dusty haze and hit the peeling letters FBI, making them shimmer as if carved from forgiveness. The caption that accompanied the clip read, "You once hid justice up your sleeve, but justice never disappeared. It simply changed form." Some people in the crowd wept, not out of sympathy for him, but because they realized sometimes what they awaited was not the fall of the powerful, but the moment he was forced to see himself, not in a mirror, but in the eyes of those he once trampled. An elderly woman, who had been coerced into signing a false confession during Delray's reign, quietly pulled out a folded piece of paper from her coat. It was a printout of an email Delray had sent, with his bold signature, "Close this case by the end of the month." She said nothing, just folded the sheet in half and slipped it into the slot of his handcuffs. The 2 officers did not stop her, did not intervene. They stood still because they understood. This was when the system repaid each debt, not with power, but with memory. That day, Rain did not give a speech. She simply wrote on the announcement board outside the Legal Aid Center a single line: "Stop laughing at pain, because when it returns, it knows the name of everyone who once laughed." And that was the end. Not in blood, not in rubble, but in a single pause, where justice was no longer a symbol, but a person, standing in the crowd, clear enough that no introduction was needed. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. What you just heard is not just a sentence passed on a man, but a warning for a system that once forgot pain, that once dismissed small voices. Each person whose voice had once been silenced today had the chance to rise. And you, listening right now, are part of that chain. Leave a comment below. It doesn't have to be long, just the truth. Have you ever witnessed injustice? Have you ever seen someone stay silent because no one stood beside them? We read every line, every story, because we believe that when people are truly heard, the world softens. Don't forget to hit like and share this video with someone who needs strength. Every share is a tap that shakes the layers of prejudice. And hit subscribe, not so we become famous, but so we have a reason to keep telling stories that make you pause, think deeper, and continue on with a warmer heart. This journey is not for those seeking entertainment alone. This journey is for those who believe that kindness, memory, and truth can still light up a world that has grown used to darkness.